This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 42 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, November 24th, Thanksgiving Day, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today we are joined by a very special guest. John Hamer is co-editor of Scattering of the Saints, Schism with Mormonism, and co-author of Community of Christ, An Illustrated History. His maps and diagrams have been featured in dozens of books and journals, including the Journal of Mormon History, Mormon Historic Studies, Restoration Studies, and the LDS Church's Joseph Smith Papers Project. Fantastic. A past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, which is the Community of Christ equivalent of the Mormon History Association, John is a frequent contributor to Mormon-themed blogs and podcasts, including Mormon Stories, Rational Faiths, Mormon Expression, Feminist Mormon Housewives, Infants on Thrones, and now Naked Mormonism. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to add this to my list, your show.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm super stoked to have you on. I met you at Sunstone in Salt Lake this last July, and I didn't get a chance to talk to you very much because I was so chaotically strewn about so many other people. And I am kicking myself that I didn't take that opportunity because you're such a fascinating guy, and your expansive knowledge of Mormon history just continually baffles me anytime I see a presentation or anything you're doing. So I was kind of hoping that we could talk about that a little bit today. Does that work for you?
Sounds great. I always love to talk about Mormon history, and I can usually do it for hours and days and weeks at a time. So,
well, the well is just so deep, you can never get to the bottom of it, I've found. Of course, I've only been studying it for 4 years. You've been studying it for much longer than me, so I'm hoping that you can kind of contextualize some of the history that we've been studying in the podcast up to this point. But before we kind of dive into the endless string of rabbit holes that'll take us into Mormon history, let me try and get a little bit of background on you here, John. Can you share with the listeners kind of what, your upbringing in the church, out of the church, and what brought you to be where you are studying Mormon history and affiliated with the Church of Christ? Kind of a broad question.
Community of Christ. So is the name.
Community of Christ. I'm sorry, my mistake.
That's all right.
Very distinct difference.
Well, there's a bunch of different churches called Church of Christ. Very interesting churches within the Restoration tradition with that, who've gone back to that name. The original church in April 6, 1830 was organized under the name Church of Christ. And so a lot of times when people in the movement are trying to get back to that early restoration experience, when they will reorganize their church or found a new church in the tradition, they'll often go back to that traditional name, Church of Christ. So that's certainly one of the names of many of the churches. So yeah, I was born in seventh generation Latter-day Saint, born in what for the LDS Church is the mission field Mormonism. So I was not from Utah, but I grew up in Minneapolis, and but left the Mormon Church as a teenager. So I didn't actually go on a mission or do endowments or anything like that. So I was a childhood Mormon. And
let me make a quick distinction. You're saying Mormon here, and the term Mormon, especially when speaking to John Hamer, is a very broad term. You're talking Brighamite LDS Mormon here, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, in that way, I'm using the term the way people in the LDS Church and the way people in Community of Christ tend to use the word, which is to say refer to members of the LDS Church, and I should be more cautious or more careful in that saying it. Different members of the different Restoration tradition churches embrace the word Mormon, and others don't. And so, for example, my friends who are Strangites, they just consider themselves to be Mormons. They use the word Mormon to refer to themselves first, and then members of the Utah Church second. And then that's also true for fundamentalist Mormons, so Brighamite Mormons who are in the churches that practice polygamy. They largely consider themselves to be Mormons and use the word Mormon, so they'll say they are fundamentalist Mormon usually. But then a lot of the other tradition churches, so the Hedrichites, the Cutlerites, the Kirtlandites, they don't use the word Mormon, and that's also true for Josephites, people who trace their church's organizational history through Joseph Smith III, which is the second president or prophet of the Community of Christ, which is to say he's the first president of the reorganization.
Yes.
So that's complicated to say it all that way, right? And anyway, so I was raised in the LDS Church, who at the time Spencer W. Kimball was the president of, so when I was a kid.
Right.
And so then I left the church and just wasn't involved in any church activity for most of my adult life. I focused on history. I did my graduate work in medieval European history, actually, and the history of cartography, of map making, and medieval maps and things like that. And in the course of doing my own family history, I started researching Mormon history around, towards the late 1990s. I just started reading up on it and becoming endlessly fascinated by the story. Something that when I'd been a kid, I'd only been exposed to the story as taught by LDS church manuals, and I was led to believe as a result that the story was just intensely, unendingly boring and dull, and that there was nothing to it.
But it couldn't be farther from the truth, though, right?
Yeah, it turned when I found out that it was so just unendingly, just mind-explodingly interesting that it caused me to just start reading it voraciously. And actually, my first, kind of serious work is on the topic that you've gotten to now in your podcast. So this time period, the Missouri time period. So the first kind of real research project that I ever did in this field is I took the land records from the U.S. government during the Missouri period and mapped out Caldwell County, which is the Mormon county where Hans Mill and Far West were located. And so we plotted out where all the farms and settlements.
Yeah, that was essentially the first county that they ran to when they were chased out of Jackson County in 1833, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So when they're chased out, they go to Clay County, which is the county that's immediately across the river from Jackson County. And so the Clay County folks, accept them as refugees, and they kind of are one of the things that often happens with the early saints is they're gathering places. The people who live immediately among them don't like them, and they find them to be obnoxious, and then they usually don't get along, and at a certain point it comes to blows and they get kicked out of the place. But then because that is such a horrible thing, and they have to flee as refugees, and they're destitute and everything like that, the people nearby then who weren't in the immediate vicinity are often just amazingly nice, and they will usually be quite great hosts, and accept the refugees in and are very generous and that kind of thing. And that certainly happened in Clay County as they helped the refugees. But then after, let's say, 4 or 5 years, it starts to roll on that they're kind of still living among the Clay Countyans. And so the Clay County people are kind of like, well, we kind of had the understanding that you guys were going to be here for a little while, and then you go back, and so and you keep not leaving.
It's that college kid that says, "Hey, can I crash on your couch for a week?" And then 6 months later, it's like, "So, dude, when are you going to get a job?" Right?
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Exactly. Get out of here and stop. And by the way, stop gathering. So we accepted like 1,000 refugees or whatever, and now there's 5,000 of you guys living here, and this has only been like 5 years, and so then the people in the Clay County, they since it was absolutely impossible. The Jackson County people were saying there is no way, we got rid of these guys and there is no way we're letting them back in our county. And so even though that was illegal, there was no way to get around it because of the law is enforced at the local level. It's enforced at the county and municipal level. And without the consent of the people in the county, there's simply no way that you could actually get back, right? So in other words, if they all just believe that you couldn't have, there was no troops that could just be like an army that would be surrounding the Mormons being allowed to live, the early members, being allowed to live in Jackson County. So anyway, the compromise that the people in Clay County proposed is, look, we got this, we're out here on the frontier. This is a brand new state. It is mostly empty still in terms of European settlement. We have recently, thanks to President Jackson, we've recently, dispossessed the Indians of all of this land. So there's all of this land for
That's a
us
really nice word for what actually happened. Dispossessed, I think, kind of colors it as like, oh, it was all right. They signed the paperwork, so it's okay. But
well, it's okay. So it's not nice at all. It was really quite horrible. So, like you say, I've said it as nicely as one can. But essentially, the reality of American history for all of us whose ancestors have been here, and anybody and everybody else who's a more recent immigrant, but who are heirs to that legacy, is one of ongoing, genocide and stealing of people's land, destruction of traditional customs and everything like that. And so that in the case of Jackson, it was the idea of it was all of the land was completely seized east of the Mississippi, and then with the promise at the time was that the western border of Missouri, that would be the permanent Indian frontier, and then everywhere immediately west of there would be Indian land forever. And so, the atrocity was justified on the basis of this permanent settlement, where Indians would get to keep that land forever, which of course happened, right? So.
Let me ask you something, and this might be related to some of the cartography studies that you've done. I was having a discussion with somebody at Sunstone, Seattle here last weekend, and they were telling me basically when the government appropriated the land from the natives, they didn't really have enough settlers, enough European settlers to flood into the area and civilize it, as they might call it. So they would do these like government stimulus packages, and one of them, which was in Jackson County, was you can put 10% down on land that you're buying for $1 an acre or whatever the case is, and then in 2 years' time you'll have to pay the rest of the balance, but it's enough to get there and settle on it. And that was kind of the genesis of a lot of troubles between the Missourians and the Mormons was, the Missourians wanted the Mormons' land that they were buying for super cheap. So they would, kind of burn their crops and destroy their businesses right before that 24-month came up, just so that they could, the government would reappropriate that land or, repossess the land from the Mormons and then sell it off at auction, and the Missourians could buy it for much cheaper. Have you run into that? Is that something that you're at all aware of, or was that guy just blowing smoke up my ass?
No, he's exactly right. It's so essentially the American dream that we're familiar with is one that is post World War II, where we're talking about having your little house with a picket fence and nuclear family and the job and, ultimately pension, whatever, all those things that don't exist anymore in a lot of cases. But the American dream of the 19th century for European Americans was being able to move out to the frontier, get new land from the government, newly, appropriated, newly stolen from the Indians and sold by the government super cheap, so that every person was able to start anew. And what you do is you create your own little subsistence farm. And by clearing the land, by making a functional subsistence farm, everybody who had any kind of, anybody who was able, who was fit and was able to put the work in, was able to create their own little independent, business of being a yeoman farmer on the frontier. And so that was true for everybody. And so when the guy was telling you that the non-Mormons were trying to, get rid of the Mormons at crucial points in the federal process, the auction process, and things like that. That is actually certainly the case. But of course, it was being played on both sides. So the Mormons were trying to do the same thing to their neighbors. So,
well, and I love how the quintessential argument between human beings has universally been land fighting. And I love how we can point back to the Missouri and Mormon conflicts and say one of the underlying themes was one of them wanted the other person's land, basically.
Yes. So property is really at the center of like Western civilization. So all of law and everything else is property. And so it's owning property, being able to maintain property ownership, all that kind of thing. And so that was definitely the case. And it's also a motivator. And it's certainly a motivator. And also just even the idea of Zion itself. So it's all within that same American dream context. And so why did they gather to Jackson County as opposed to Kirtland, where the headquarters was? Kirtland, the problem there was that that was already an existing settlement. All of that farmland had already been bought by the government. It had already been improved. So unless you had a lot of money, you'd have to be able to go in and buy a prosperous or at least functioning or an established farm from somebody. You weren't able to just move there, whereas every poor person who heard the Mormon gospel preached, whether they're in post First Industrial Revolution Britain and are all absolutely impoverished and are coming across penniless, or whether you have failed at whatever other job you're doing anywhere else in the East Coast and are moving, you could move to Missouri more or less free, like you say. You stake out the land that you're going to, clear as a farm, and then at a certain point, the proceeds from your industry are enough to buy the land from the government. So,
but when you have people that are that have a motivation that you do not fulfill that obligation, and they chase you out of your home, or burn your business or your crops, that kind of becomes a problem, and you get foreclosed on essentially by the government from that.
You wouldn't even be able to take the claim out. So in other words, you at a certain points. So we have the land records for Caldwell County, as I mentioned. So I started in on the mapping of that county, which is the county that has Far West, the county that has Haunts Mill. That's the county that the state specifically created for Latter-day Saint settlement. So it was made as a compromise. Since they couldn't go back to Jackson County, we'll give you a county. That's the idea.
Yeah. Well, and let's just say that most of this time they were operating under like these quasi-legal type of civil councils, almost like in Jackson County when they were chasing the Mormons out in the late 33. Before that, they were trying to kick them out by a legal stance, get the governor on their side, and hold these city councils. It's not like this persecution narrative that we're sold, where it's just these mobs suddenly form and then chase the Mormons out. It was much more along the lines of these people were trying to get the Mormons out for various reasons, and they were forming these legal sort of councils, and then when that didn't work, they decided to resort to mob violence after that.
Well, so the councils aren't entirely legal, but yes,
quasi-legal.
They're like it's like essentially, and frankly, the Mormons do the same thing. So this is anyway, but yeah, like you say, they're getting together, and if you can get pretty much everybody, in the county who they all then decide that this group of people represents a nuisance, which is what was happening in Jackson County. So they all kind of got together and said, this is a nuisance, and we're kind of all, signing an open declaration that we want you to leave kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And but that isn't particularly legal, but it is expressing kind of the will of the county and your capacity to stay there. And mm-hmm. So, like you say, all of that, and there was it wasn't, getting kicked out ultimately when they did have recourse to violence and burning property and all that kind of thing in order to actually force the people out of the county.
But the Mormons weren't very popular. Like when, in the 40s when Joseph was meeting with Martin Van Buren, and I think it was Joseph and Rigdon and a couple of other people. I think Hiram Smith was involved as well. The Mormons weren't necessarily popular. So Martin Van Buren eventually was like, I can't help you guys. I know that you have the law on your side because they chased you out, but I mean, you don't have the populations, you're not on the population side, and if I side with the Mormons, then I will lose next cycle's election. Simple as that. So I mean, politics definitely played into this as well.
Right. So there's like a pragmatic section to that, and there isn't actually, the federal government didn't have anything that they could do about it at all. So there wasn't anything.
Really?
I mean, actually, there was nothing to be done. But anyway, the one thing what they were actually trying for, and the Mormons were enough aware of this, was what did the government have? The government had land. And so the petition that, like you're talking about, this goal, and one of the wonderful things we have as historians now is that Mormons went through and created this entire, probably self-inflated census of all the property and suffering and everything that they had, and it's hundreds and hundreds of pages long, that they've sworn out all the affidavits of all the property that they had and lost in Missouri and everything like that, which is true that they did lose a huge amount of stuff. But they sent that, like you say, as a petition to Congress. So anyway, as a result of that, we really do have a sense of who was there. Every single person who might have been there wrote down their kind of maximal dollar value of what they think they lost. So we have a wonderful document for that. But anyway, so what was the goal of doing that? It is to Congress then, because Congress had an infinite amount of land that it had stolen from the Indians. So what the goal would be, let's say that the Congress will then give you, let's say, 2 or 3 counties worth of land in Iowa, which Congress had the power to do. So then you would just own it outright. And so then the church would own like all those new farms for free. And so that would be one of the options that was available. So there was all kinds of different tracts of land that the federal government would give, let's say, to, to war widows or something, and something like that where there's a worthy cause.
But did that ever happen, though? I don't recall reading that in any of the books that I've read so far.
No, they never. The Mormons never got it.
For the Mormons, I mean,
no, but other people got it.
Okay, other people, but the Mormons did not. Okay.
Well, because nobody particularly, like you said, nobody particularly liked them. They didn't have enough national sympathy to make it make sense. There's only so much land. I mean, the Congress has lots of land, but they're going to give it, if possible, to their own cronies or anybody who some place to get a lot of public sympathy, or they've got to have a reason. They're not going to just give everybody all the land, so they're making money. Or,
veterans from the War of 1812 or whatever the case may be. That makes a fair amount of sense. So I think that kind of sets up the kind of the public dynamic that led to Far West being settled and established, kind of being the sanctuary in Missouri away from Jackson County. Let's kind of move on the timeline forward a little bit. What kind of led to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, Brigham Young, various members fleeing Kirtland and getting to Far West?
So one of the reasons, like I say, that Kirtland had less settlement actually the entire time that Kirtland is the headquarters of the church. There's actually fewer saints gathered there than there is in Missouri. And that's even though it's church headquarters, even though that's where the temple is, even though that's where the presidency are. And it's because they can't afford farms there.
Right. So, and they were sending everybody to Missouri. Come settle, give us your money, and then we'll send you out to Missouri to settle.
But because that's the only place they could get land.
Right.
So in other words, if they could have had people like take over and make a big, zone, they had platted out a huge town for Kirtland. They wanted to build it up, but they didn't have the money ever to do it. So they're hobbled by that. And in fact, there's already an existing economic structure of people that have established farms, established towns, and everything like that all around Kirtland. And some of those interests then are also antagonistic to the Mormons building up their own town in Kirtland. And so at a certain point, the members of the church all feel like, these people who have their banks, they're cheating us, and we can never get ahead because we don't control our own banks, our own money, we don't control the local government and things like that. And so they decide they're going to launch their own bank, which you guys probably have talked about.
Society.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when that bank, which they don't know anything about banking, so they don't know what banks are, they don't get it. And it's ultimately not chartered. It's a wildcat bank. You've gone through all that.
And when that came up in the timeline, we actually read through the articles of establishment for the Kirtland Safety Society, and I invited on somebody that is actually a financial advisor from another podcast called Skeptic Money, or the Phil Ferguson Show, sorry. And we went through it line by line. I think there are 17 or 19 articles, and it's very clear that they were founding it for very shady purposes, almost like they were founding it as a solution to something as opposed to being an investment. It's I don't know exactly what to say about it, but
and so it collapsed. It collapsed more or less immediately. And although people like to say it's because of the panic of 1837 or whatever, it collapses before that, and because it's not on a sound basis, and they don't understand how banking works. It's essentially the entire thing is almost all the capital in the thing is based on lot values of a Kirtland city plat, as if Kirtland, as if Kirtland would have expanded and become valuable, right? And given that all of that, land values are more or less all speculative, and it's also you can't immediately sell property lots in order to. It's not liquid capital, and so the result of it is that the bank isn't actually having any kind of basis in any kind of liquid capital, and so it collapses. Anyway, in the middle of all of that, go ahead.
There was also a bit to do with rapid inflation as well, and that was kind of done at the as an unpleasant byproduct of their very shady business practices. Because, I mean, William Hines Phelps, he had a good argument against Joseph Smith when Joseph bought those 3 plots of land for $100 or whatever, and then he sold them to W.W. Phelps for $1,000 or $2,000, and then held him to that debt, saying you have to pay that. But I think Joseph only did that in response because somebody was about to take him to court for debts that Joseph owed to that guy. So it's like it's this big incestuous fustercluck, as you might want to call it, of a negative feedback of debt. And nobody had the high ground here, and it's all chaos. And to point to like one thing, saying it was a panic of 1837 or it was just poor management that did it. No, it was an amalgamation of every single pressure and societal difference that was going on with the Kirtland Safety Society and the Mormons at the time.
Yeah, and they print, like you say, so they printed all that money. They all thought for a second that they were super rich. They're all suddenly going from being super poor to being millionaires because they have all this fake money.
I mean, what's ultimately monopoly money. So
so now they're really rich. But anyway, so like you say, that all collapses, and so when property, like we mentioned at the beginning of this, that property is the basis of everything, and so now, in the case of Kirtland, all of these people who really had believed in the bank because the bank is intermingled in terms of the claims with the faith claims of a prophet who founded the bank, and so for all of these people who did put their money in. So all of these important early leaders of the High Council, for example, the Kirtland High Council, which would have been, they don't make it into our understanding today when we tell the story of general authorities, but the presiding High Council of the church there, the High Council at Kirtland, all of those general authorities of the church are every bit as important as the members of the traveling High Council, the people who are apostles, who ultimately get more important as the story evolves, but contemporaneously, the High Council people are probably more important in terms of their leadership of the church. And they're the people who are a little bit older. They're the people who had any property, and they're people who then lost all of their property. And so as a result of that,
they had traded in that property for monopoly money.
That's right. Yeah. And
that's
so
horrible.
Yeah.
And they did it because Joseph, being the prophet, said that this is the will of God to found this bank, found this company, and when you intermingle ecclesiastical and civil authority the way that Joseph Smith was embodied in a single person, you kind of run into problems with that, with land ownership. And that being the basis for so much of the conflict that was going on, it's kind of hard to say that Joseph was the one true prophet if he didn't see something like this coming through his own practices.
Right. It definitely causes, if you were thinking of his prophethood as being that, as encompassing all of that, you would found a rude awakening when it turned out that the bank immediately went bankrupt, right?
Well,
and you lost all of your property. Yeah, of course, and they all did, like you say, and that's one of the reasons why they put their money in the first place. And then in the course of doing that, then all of these important early leaders leave the. So I think it's a majority of the people at the High Council and their families, leave, and they stay in Kirtland, and they're no longer associated with the main line of the church. And so
the main line of the church moved from Kirtland, fled Kirtland to go to Far West. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what remained in Kirtland after Joseph and Rigdon and Brigham Young went and fled to Far West. What was left there? I know Warren Parrish was one of them that he broke off and made the Parrishites, and you have Joseph Coe, Cyrus Smalling, and Martin Harris founding their own Church of Christ, essentially. Can we talk a little bit about what was left in Kirtland there?
Yeah. So essentially The church in Kirtland continues to exist. It excommunicates the presidency. So Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon are kicked out of the church. The church reorganizes, like you say, as one of the leaders of this now is Warren Parrish, who had been Joseph Smith's secretary. So he's one of the leaders of the church that continues in Kirtland. And then other people that are important there, like I think Joseph Coe, he's a member of the High Council. So the Kirtland High Council. So he's also a general authority. And then Martin Harris, as you mentioned, he stays and he is a member of this church. And so the church does this thing that you do when you decide, okay, something went wrong. So it's clear. The church here went bankrupt. We had to kick the founding prophet out of the church. He's clearly a false prophet based on the bank thing, right? And so we can, and so then what you do is often is you say, well, where did we go wrong? And so one of the things that kind of happens when you're on this path, and it's something that happens fairly frequently when there's a schism within the church, is that you decide to start peeling back the onion. And so, well, what's clearly wrong when we founded a bank? So that's wrong. Right. And so that we undo that. And so we pull that onion back. Well, it was wrong when we changed the name of the church. So the church in Kirtland had become called...
Yeah, that's back to 1834 with the Zion's camp when it changed to the Church of the Latter-day Saints, right?
Exactly, right.
So what do you go back before that? If Zion's camp was wrong, what do you go back to before that? When the Melchizedek priesthood surfaced in 1832-ish?
Right, and so they decided that was wrong. So it was clear that they decide that when anything that you add, like the Melchizedek priesthood, anything that's not part of primitive Christianity. So in other words, anything that isn't part of the New Testament church, that's what we originally signed up for. We wanted to be the real Church of Christ of the New Testament.
So eventually you can peel it back and just drop the onion on the floor and say the Book of Mormon at its foundation and Joseph Smith are not necessarily restorationist. What are we doing following this guy, right?
Right. And then when you've peeled the onion back and you say that Joseph Smith was never a prophet and the Book of Mormon isn't scripture, then you turn around inside your church in Kirtland Temple and you realize, well, Martin Harris is part of your church. And Martin Harris says, I have a firm testimony of the Book of Mormon. You have now peeled the onion back farther than I'm willing to go, right? And so at a certain point, they atomize because they can't decide on what's the thing that the point at which they all agree,
Right. Well, and it causes everybody to have their own interpretations, which I know a lot of especially during the succession crisis, there were a lot of people that left it up to, personal revelation. Like I know James Strang was kind of one of the primary prophets after the schism crisis in 44. And when you say that, it's like, okay, so are we a prophet? Are we a church led by a single prophet, or are we all led by our own personal revelations? And when you try and, tackle that one problem, I mean, those are mutually exclusive the way I see it, because you can't have a single prophet that speaks for God if you're, walking by your own idea of what revelation is, in my own opinion. But I mean,
it's the tension that's there, right?
Yeah. Like how far can you peel this back before it becomes not a thing anymore?
Right. And so it only they can only peel it back for a year or so, and then it ceased to exist. And so their organization breaks down in Kirtland. But there continue to be, let's say, people who are Latter-day Saints of some variety, even if they're not organized. They continue to exist in Kirtland, and there have always been then people who believe something or other in Latter-day Saint traditions, and usually, and they live in Kirtland. And then usually when people come into town, like missionaries, like you mentioned Strang, when Strang eventually comes to Kirtland and has a big conference there and reorganizes the stake in there, and all the old people come out and they all, decide, yay, we're getting back together, we're getting it going. And so Kirtland becomes a stake of the Strangite church for a while. And that'll happen again and again and again. So essentially Kirtland continues to be a minor center or gathering place of Latter-day Saintism that ultimately the little group there joins the reorganization, by the 1860s.
Can we take a tiny tangent here? And can you kind of tell me, like, the Kirtland Temple, the ownership of the Kirtland Temple? I know that it was kind of up in the air for a little while. How did it come to be owned by the Community of Christ and kind of like a co-ownership with the LDS Church, basically. How did that happen?
There's no co-ownership. The LDS Church has no ownership at all of the Kirtland Temple. So the Kirtland
kidding.
The Kirtland Temple is owned by Community of Christ outright.
Okay, but my I have family members that are on a mission for the church, and they're the managers or the facility managers of the Kirtland Temple. They're members of the LDS Church. So how does that work?
They're not. You have misunderstood what they're doing. So they are facilities managers of historic Kirtland, in quotes around there. Historic Kirtland is the LDS history park or whatever that has certain historical buildings, like the Newell K. Whitney store, for example. Right. And then they've reconstructed a couple others, like the Johnson Inn. They've made a replica building, and there's a couple other buildings anyway that are actual historic buildings that the Mormon Church owns, and so they own that little park, and your missionary relatives are working there. The temple is owned by Community of Christ, and my friend Seth Bryant is the director of the temple. He's a member of Community of Christ.
That makes a lot more sense, and I guess that taps into my own ignorance, because I haven't done the typical Mormon tour yet. I haven't been to Nauvoo and Kirtland and Palmyra. I haven't done that tour yet.
Oh, you should go. You'll love it. It's a wonderful.
I plan on going definitely before my family members are done with their mission, because they said we'll give you the back behind the stage tour, and that sounds really, really good. Go up and tour the attic of the Newell K. Whitney store, see where Joseph was living for his first year and a half when he lived or moved to Kirtland, and fascinating stuff. So okay, so that makes a lot more sense now. So so let's get back onto Kirtland. It basically fell apart once they excommunicated the leadership. The leadership moved out to Far West, and they lived there for barely a year, less than a year before they were arrested. Is that right?
Yeah. So it immediately goes south as soon as they get there.
Yeah, and that's through no small fault of Rigdon preaching his salt sermon and his Independence Day sermon, because those were just bloodthirsty. We will chase these people to their homes and spill their blood. It's a war of extermination between them. And then, of course, October comes along. Lilburn Boggs signs a Mormon extermination order. We have the Hans Mill massacre happens 3 days after that. Then the standoff at Far West, where they're eventually arrested and taken to Liberty Jail. And then Rigdon, if I remember this correctly, he kind of organized with one of the jail guards an escape attempt, and he ran away and then went and bought Commerce. Is that correct?
That's very simplified. I think that Rigdon got out earlier, and I don't remember exactly how he got away. But he's not. I don't know that Rigdon is with them at Liberty Jail anymore. Anyway, he's definitely, maybe he is, but anyway, he gets away earlier for possibly for medical reasons, but maybe because of. So essentially, hundreds of members, everybody who's important in the leadership of the church, is arrested at Far West, and they're brought to trial in Richmond. And then after the preliminary hearings, they let most everybody go. So they decide that the state decides to hold on to Joseph Smith and a couple other key ringleaders. But more or less anybody who was important got arrested and was being held in Richmond, initially. But then it was down to just Joseph Smith and a couple of other key leaders that they were holding on to in the end. In terms of the Commerce, that like you say, the people, Joseph Smith isn't directing where they're going to. And so one of those things that happens is when they're all kicked out of the state, they cross the winter and they become refugees in Illinois. And that same thing that had happened in Clay County, where non-Mormons had reacted with a lot of sympathy to the refugees, happened again in Illinois. And so people in the Quincy, Illinois, just really opened the doors and everything like that. And they were thinking originally, I think, of settling up in Iowa. And so the goal maybe was to settle across the river from Nauvoo in Lee County, Iowa. And they had a settlement there which they named Zarahemla, which was going to be a stake. But the people in Illinois, but the people in Illinois kept on wooing them to come across. So for a lot of reasons, well,
why? Like the Mormons, everywhere that they go, everything around them just dies or turns to chaos. Like, why would they want to court the Mormons to have them settle in Nauvoo? I mean, that seems absolutely absurd.
Yeah. It didn't, people weren't I guess it's because the track record wasn't proven yet, right? So I think after the Illinoisans kick them out, I don't think anybody was going to be saying, hey, come visit, be with us. Actually, the Texans were saying that. But anyway, so it's possible that, when it's not happening immediately to you, you think, well, Illinoisans all thought, well, Missourians are all rotten people anyway. These
they're all slave owners and
stuff, these jerks and pukes or whatever they called them. And as a result, we were going to be able to have all these people come. They're industrious people. They'll be hopefully, and both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party elite members. So are trying. So Stephen Douglas, who's one of the leaders of the Democratic Party there, and are trying to court the Mormon vote too. And so they definitely think at first that it would be. Yeah, well, but Democrats and Whigs, and they're kind of balanced. And so both of them would like to have the Mormon vote. So
interesting. Well, and I know that was kind of one of the sticking points in Missouri was so many of the Missourians were mad at the Mormons because they were influencing votes. And there were at the voting booth, there were these standoffs where, a bunch of the Missouri mob would gather together and prevent the Mormons from actually voting. And then, I forget which Mormon it was, but he picked up a stick and just started swinging it at the Missouri mob. And that was, one of the big catalysts that caused this. So I guess that makes sense if they're trying to sway the vote in Illinois to be one side or the other. Why not get the Mormons to settle in mass in Nauvoo? Because that's a lot. That's thousands of possible votes that otherwise wouldn't have been there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the election battle that you're talking about, as it's called, it's called the Gallatin Election Day battle. That is a much smaller scenario, even though it has this kind of. It's historically called a battle. It's like you say, it's a brawl. It's kind of an old Westy brawl.
It's a dude
where
swinging a stick.
Yeah, where people with sticks and that kind of. They might have been shooting, but essentially, it's a bunch of drunk Missourians who were going to vote, and a couple people tried to stop the Mormons from voting, and they had a big fight. And it isn't exactly clear if the Mormons got to vote or not, but essentially, the Missourians were maybe more drunk and lost the fight. Probably, who knows what exactly happened, even though I don't remember. But essentially, that's a little bit different scenario. So that's as opposed to an established state where you are trying to, in the state government, you're trying to take over the state legislature through having loyal voters as part of your political network. In the case of in Daviess County, which is the county that's north of Caldwell County, this is that county that Gallatin is at, where this election brawl takes place, but also it's the county where the Mormon settlements of Adam-on-Diamond is. So in that case, the goal is to control the county itself. So it is a county that has just been formed, and this is the very first kind of votes to be who's going to be the municipally in charge of the county courthouse, who's going to be the judges, who's going to whose establishment is going to be in charge of this county. So the Mormons have their own county in Caldwell County, and so therefore they are in charge of the militia there and everything else. So now if the Mormons can take over Daviess County, where they're probably in relatively equal numbers with the non-Mormon settlers of this very frontier county that's just been carved out of the forest, then essentially you're going to get kicked out. And so the way it would work is that, so let's say you're Gallatin, which is the county seat, but it's just a very tiny new settlement that's just like Far West has just barely been, has some. When
you say just barely, we're talking 36, a year before before they started, the leadership moved to Far West, it was designated as Daviess County, if I'm not mistaken, 36, 37, something like that. So it had just now happened.
That's right. Yeah. And in fact, very little of the land in the county had actually even come to the point where it could be bought even from the government. There's just one little section of it. So most of the land, including the land that Adam-on-Diamond and I think Gallatin were on, was still in the hands of the federal government, and you were just having to squat on it in preparation for that fall when it would be offered for sale at auction, like you say. And so it's all very, very new stuff. But the reality then of Gallatin is, let's say you owned the land at Gallatin and you were part of that city plat that already existed on there, you'd be allowed to buy it because of just a regular customary rule of the frontier that you would buy that. But if that now doesn't become the county seat, if that doesn't become a town, suddenly that little lot that you have, this little town, everything that you've done, it's not only, it's like it's back to being a farmer's field. And so there's a very big difference in terms of the value of a farmer's field, or a little tiny fraction of it, which is what a city plot would be. And so let's say Adam-ondi-Ahman becomes the capital, or the county seat, which is designed to be. Then suddenly all of the Mormon holdings are now very valuable, and you don't want to even be living in a county that they're controlling, and nobody will buy it. And so Joseph Smith actually brags. He has a letter, encouraging everybody to move out to Caldwell and Daviess counties, because he says the old settlers, they're all fleeing and they're selling, their property at half price because they know it won't be worth anything. So he's very aware of the dynamics here.
Wow, that's remarkable. So it just gets back to this central point that so much of the tensions and the focus of the fighting that was going on, especially the infighting in the church, was all just land. It was all relative to land. Well, not all of it, but that was a heavy contributing factor to it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so let's move to Nauvoo then. So we're getting a sense for what was going on with Missouri, and essentially by the end of 38, 39, the Mormons were no longer welcome in Missouri. Is that correct?
So some people were able to stay. So you mentioned the exterminating order. That's not technically a legal order, and it never was. And it also probably had no relationship at all with the Hunts Mill massacre, even though post hoc ergo propter hoc. It happened afterwards, but it's not. It actually is not under any. So the people who the reality is with frontier life, the difference between being part of the actual official state militia and being part of a mob that is engaged in illegal activity is pretty much this turning your bandana around, or something as a cowboy, and so these guys were the people who had the Hunt Mill battle were operating illegally as opposed to operating legally.
The sticking point, though, was they were doing it under the blessing of Lilburn Boggs. Boggs had signed in this extermination order, and he did this in response. Including the word extermination in it, was in response to Sidney Rigdon's 4th of July speech saying it will be a war of extermination between us and the Missourians. So, as far as being legal or not, or ethical, I guess being, if you have the governor's blessing to be an unarmed militia, that's kind of the point of having a state militia, if I'm not mistaken, even if the governor himself is in the wrong.
Well, they aren't acting, in the case of the Hunt Mill, they're not acting in that case as the state militia. So, and they probably won't have even been able, even if that order had happened 3 days earlier, it probably hadn't made it to anybody who was part of that particular mob. So in that case,
I've heard that said many, many times, and I think that's patently absurd to say that, in my own opinion. People, and I say that only because I think that when the actual extermination order came out, it was something that I assume Boggs had been working on, or many people had been working on for quite some time, maybe a couple of weeks. And then finally, they were just waiting for Boggs' signature in order to actually take action in this quasi-legal sense. Because if they would have done it without Boggs' blessing, then they would be in the wrong and they would be held liable for whatever happens. But once Boggs signs the extermination order, maybe somebody up at the head of this Missouri mob is, in cahoots, or is, I shouldn't say in cahoots, but in league with Boggs, and Boggs says, hey, I'm going to sign this on this day. That's when the extermination order is. Get your men together and start riding to far west. That's how I see it in my own opinion, but I don't have much studying to back that up.
I think that you have way more faith as a 21st century person in a piece of paper than anybody on the frontier cared at all about. So they had as a precedent. They didn't care what Boggs wrote on the paper or not. I would argue it's because they actually have as their precedent, the kicking people out of Jackson County, and nobody ever faced any consequences for that. So people are able in their local zones. There's this thing that happens on The Simpsons, where anything that happens and suddenly there's people of Springfield immediately form a mob. I don't know if you've seen that on the show, where they immediately all have the pickaxes and their torches, and they march and they en masse. That is what frontier life was like. And so,
well, they didn't have TV to entertain them. It's like, what else are we gonna? Let's either go watch the preacher talk or let's go form a mob. I'm bored, right?
Right. And so these kind of this kind of mob action was already been happening, back and forth between the Mormons and the non-Mormons in that area. So the Mormons had already formed an illegal militia, the Danites. They had gone up they crossed the county line, which is not allowed, from Caldwell County into Davies County, and they had expelled everybody who's non-Mormon from the county. And by expelling, that means they went to their farm, they warned them out, they
appropriated.
And they burned their houses down. They took all the property that the people left, and they took that back to Adamon-Bayam and consecrated to the bishop's storehouse. So they burned down Gallatin, they burned down Millport, they burned down all of the non-Mormon settlements and kicked them out of the county.
And we can just say that, like, they felt extremely justified in doing this because that had happened to them in Jackson County a mere 4 years before.
Right.
So you can say that somebody was in the right or somebody was in the wrong, but really this is a very muddled mess of ethics that there's really no simple way to describe or way out of.
Right. And so that's why I say I don't think that the people who happen to be the group that maybe was from, I think they're pretty much from the county, kind of in the northeastern direction of, we'd have to go through. Alexander Baugh has the main book on all the participants in the Huntsville massacre. And so he's gone through and traced out who all these guys are. But I think essentially they're just going to be functioning that way regardless. They're trying to do this thing where they're warning everybody out. They had warned the people in that settlement out. And so that's one of the reasons why everybody had come as refugees for defense to Far West. And since they hadn't left, then the response is a mob comes and to burn all your stuff down. But in this case, they also killed people. So they killed all the people that were left as the defenders. And so that's certainly, though, part of mob action. And so I don't think that they needed the exterminating order to have any benefit of that. And it doesn't necessarily have any benefit. It's just a matter of, they were right in thinking that they wouldn't be prosecuted, and they weren't. So that was actually correct. In terms of the exterminating order, that actually did empower then, or the calling out of the militia is something that also did happen. And so the official state militias were called out from all around the state, and they actually marched on Far West, and then that was actually led then by generals that are like local lawyers and the local county leaders, and they actually went and negotiated the surrender of the people in Far West. So that was the official militia at that point. So
right. Well, and if I'm not mistaken, the person that was at the head of that mob, the names escape me here. Maybe you're better with names and I'm better with dates in this case, but the head of the Missouri mob that was able to basically lay siege to Far West for a 72-hour period and got Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith to surrender, he tried to hold a tribunal and convict Joseph to death right on the spot. And if I remember correctly, Joseph was able to barely squeak out because one guy said that, no, this is cold-blooded murder. I will not kill the prophet here, and I'm taking him under my protection, basically, until we can have a proper hearing for this guy. Is that correct?
Right. So this is not a mob. That is the militia. So that is the official.
That's a legally
militia.
militia.
That's not a mob. And so, so the leader in charge, the general in charge, wanted to do a court martial. So what he's saying is that because all of the different, his argument here is because the Joseph Smith and the other leaders are acting as a rebel unit. They have a unit of the state militia for Caldwell County, and they have acted in open rebellion or something like that is what his legal take on it was. So therefore they're subject to court martial. And so the court martial then would have found Joseph Smith and the other leaders guilty of treason and executed them summarily. But like you mentioned, one of the other generals, who was the general from Clay County, that guy who had been the lawyer who had helped create Caldwell County for the Mormons in the first place, Alexander Donovan. So he's the person who says, no, we can't do that. And now these people have all surrendered, and it's now, now it will be a case for the civil courts. So then they negotiated the the surrender of Joseph Smith and the other leaders, who then, like you say, they took about 100 leaders to Richmond, which was the nearest, county seat, and that's where they started holding the trial. It was a civil trial.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that many people. I mean, I guess it was, all of the members of the 70, the quorums of the leadership, the presidency in Missouri, the prophet and his presidency. I pretty much everybody that was in Missouri that held any sort of office whatsoever was just dragged into this court. From what I
pretty much, yeah. I mean, or anybody had known was in the Danites or anything like that, right? So it would be different stuff. So because, for example, Brigham Young hadn't been a particularly important leader up until this time, that's why he wasn't arrested. So when we sometimes hear about Brigham Young, he'd only kind of just got to Missouri. He wasn't a particularly important guy. And that's why we sometimes hear of him as being like taking charge, and helping lead the church out of Missouri. That's kind of where he first enters into the story. It's pretty much because he wasn't important enough to arrest. And so he goes and becomes, he takes charge as the acting president of the Far West High Council. And then the High Council kind of organizes the retreat, of everybody, all the refugees out of the state. So.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. So that's basically when Brigham Young begins to set himself apart as somebody that actually might have something more to contribute than just being a member of the church. And so that's basically when he rises to the presidency of the Quorum of the 12, and he doesn't ever... he eventually uses that as a point to say that I have rightful claim to the throne in 46, right?
Yeah. Well, so he hadn't been president of the 12 at that point because it was the original 12, many of whom had left because at Kirtland, right? So about half leave after the bank failure.
Half. Wow. Okay.
Whatever it is. I think maybe a couple of them come back. But anyway, it's a bunch of them leave. Anyway, through the course of this, half of the original 12 at the end of this two events anyway are gone. So Thomas Marsh has been it was originally ordered by how old you were. And so in other words, seniority in the 12, the original 12 were how, who was the oldest guy of the 12 when they started. And that was Thomas Marsh. And so he left, along with, Orson Hyde, right? And so he left during the Missouri Mormon War. So what ended up happening, we mentioned that thing where the Danites, where the church leaders, including Joseph Smith, everybody, where they burned all the different settlements in Daviess County and kicked all the Mormons out. In doing that, Thomas Marsh felt that had crossed a line of what he could be on board with, and so he left and fled to Richmond, where he swore out affidavits against what was going on. And so he now is no longer part of the church anymore. So that's one guy out. Wow. And then the next most senior guy, or the next oldest guy, was David W. Patton. And so he was the most militant of the apostles, and he was one of these guys that led the charge in the Battle of Crooked River, in which he was one of the only casualties. And so he died. Okay. Yep. So he'd been called Captain Fear Not because he just had no fear. But then he also, charged right into the attacking of the Missouri militia at Crooked River and was killed. And so that left.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't David Patton one of the people that Joseph gave a revelation to that said, in 5 years, you'll do this thing, and he was dead 5 months later from this, after that revelation was given?
And I'm not remembering it. I don't know. Probably that kind of thing happened, but I don't know. So I don't remember. I do know that he got wounded and he got dragged away. Yeah. I mean, there's other people that felt themselves to be invulnerable too. There was a guy who's Jared Carter, and his brother was, Gideon Carter, who was the brother of Jared Carter, so he would call himself the brother of Jared. And either he also got killed there or he was wounded. In other words, they all felt, in this battle, when they went down to attack, they were attacking a unit of the state militia again. They crossed the boundary out of Caldwell County, which is where the battle took place, Crooked River.
There was a reason why they were doing this. They didn't just say, hey, there's a Missouri militia, let's attack them. No, that the militia had taken some Mormons not hostage, but as prisoner, essentially, if I'm not mistaken, right? Okay, so that was a catalyst that created Crooked.
Right, and they also thought it was a mob, right? So they thought it was a group of mob guys, right? They didn't realize that it had been legitimately called out as the militia. And so, because it's not really, you can't tell the difference. Nobody has there's not a lot of fancy uniforms really, or that you might not even anyway. So they weren't particularly sure, and they didn't know that. And so, but they did by forming their own militia, which was a Danite militia too, and which is not legal, and then crossing the county line to go, to attack or even to get a prisoner back or anything like that. That's not actually also legal. And so in that doing that though, that's where for the court-martial idea later, or even the regular trial, this is where you would be liable for prosecution, where you've broken the law, right?
Yeah, and I mean, quite clearly, the Battle of Crooked River was essentially Mormons' fault, and it turned into this catalyst that eventually led to Far West being sieged. Like, this was basically a turning point where the governor and where was it General Carlin, maybe he was governor at the time, said, okay, these guys mean business. Like, the Mormons aren't just screwing around. They're not just a crazy religious sect. They're actually a militia, and the militia cross state lines, which turns them into an army, essentially. Right. I can see why the people were scared of the Mormons, or why they didn't like them at this time.
Well, in both sides. So again, we're in this era where the news is simply just people like running to your town or riding a horse to your town and then screaming all this crazy stuff, right? And so people really thought that there had been a big battle up at the Gallatin election battle, and maybe a lot of people died. And when the Crooked River battle happened, they really thought that the Mormons had like massacred this entire unit. And actually, those guys had just all run in different directions, and they all thought each other had all been killed. I don't think that, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know that anybody on the Missourian side actually died. Somebody was pretty.
I think there were 3 casualties and 1 death, if I'm recalling correctly, but I could be wrong. So, but I mean, it wasn't a slaughter though.
But they really thought, the rumor was that the Mormons had killed everybody, and that everybody, so they really thought that there had, and so that was like one of these things that was happening. So Boggs is down in Springfield or wherever he's at, and so they're constantly getting these different rumors back and forth, and so they're calling out all the militias, but then they think, oh well, we have it. Actually, it's all. Now that they get a better report, they're like, okay, well, let's uncall it out, but then let's call it out again. So it's the failure of like news and rumor and everything like that. But ultimately, it's this, like you say, these actual fights that take place outside of Caldwell County. So it's all the refugees from Daviess County who say the Mormons have stolen our property and kicked us out. They burned Gallatin down. It's the state militia who says the Mormons have crossed the line and the county line and attacked the state militia. And then ultimately, it's the affidavits from first all of the dissenters. So, like you mentioned, the Gulliver Cowdery, the Whitmers, they had moved to Richmond after they had been warned out of the county and dispossessed of all of their property in Caldwell County by the Mormons. So they are there and, more or less saying that we've been kicked out and lost everything. And then finally, the affidavits of the president of the 12 who says these guys they've crossed a line, and they're so anyway, all of that kind of comes together, and that is one of the reasons why the militia is legitimately called out to deal with this crisis, and the extermination order though is not obviously a legitimate response, so that and wouldn't have been a legal response. So what ends up happening is, like you say, that after they the settlement that gets imposed on the Mormons, that they have to sign over all of their property in order to, after they've arrested all the leaders, now all the rest of the Mormons have to sign over all of their property as an indemnity to pay for the militia, being called out. That's totally illegal. So in other words, but it's still imposed and it was forced. So everybody lost everything. Wow. And they're kicked out.
So the Mormons
refugees.
Got screwed here.
They got totally screwed. And then even though they held this trial for Joseph Smith and the other leaders, which may well have been quite a legitimate trial to have given what had all had happened, nobody called anybody else to trial. So in other words, there was no trial for anybody who killed anybody at Hans Mill. There's none of these. That's an illegal action. It was a mob that did that. There's no trial for any other one of the anything else that was done illegally on the Missourian side. So it's not like any justice was had, in the whole course of this thing.
Yeah, so let me ask you kind of, maybe give me your opinion, and maybe hopefully you can back your opinion up with stuff, because that's how I like to formulate my opinions and how I think most people formulate their opinions. What is your opinion for why the Mormons got so legally screwed in this sense? Like, why were the Missourians such dicks to the Mormons?
Well, so I think that what ended up happening was that the leaders of the Missouri church had a long time, let's say, relationship. So this is the Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery. They had been involved with the negotiations that created a compromise for Mormon settlements. In other words, created a county. So the Missourians were clearly at a certain point, some of the Missourians, the more law and order minded Missourians, were willing to work with the Mormon leaders. And so the Missouri church people kind of understood that. And part of the idea of creating a county, we're giving you guys a county. So one of the ideas of that was that you will go and live in that county.
Right.
And that's where you should be. And so, and don't be in our part of some our counties and that kind of thing. But
right. Tape down the middle of the floor, like sitcom style. This is your county, my county. Right. Stay on your side. Stay on your side. And that is not legal. Okay, so that's not a legal settlement at all. That is simply a gentleman's agreement or whatever that David Whitmer and everybody made with Donovan and the other Missourian leaders. But when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon come after having lost control of the church in Kirtland, after the church in Kirtland, collapses and they, there's recriminations anyway, they leave and they get out to Missouri. They aren't in this mood to compromise with any rivals. And so the first thing that they do is decapitate the Missouri church. So they kick out the Whitmers and everybody. So anybody who has had this kind of relationship with the locals and neighbors, they're gone and they're out. And so now the church and its leadership in Missouri don't have any of that institutional memory of of how we've been getting along and navigating this kind of tinderbox out here on the frontier. And so the very first thing that Joseph Smith does is he starts sending out new colonies. So they go and they settle the county to the north. So they make a settlement at Adamon-Diamond. And then way more worrisome to the Missourians is they make this settlement called DeWitt. So they purchase this plat from these land speculators of this failed settlement, DeWitt. And DeWitt is over in Carroll County, which is at the place where the Grand River comes and meets the Missouri River. And the Grand River is the river that goes up to where Gallatin and Adamon-Diamond are. And so essentially, since rivers are the way that people are transporting things, it looks like you could... everything. Yeah, commerce, everything. So it looks like from DeWitt, the idea is that the Mormons are going to take control of all of northwestern Missouri. And so people start to really think that, and they're concerned about that. And so one of the very first illegal actions that takes place is that all the people in Carroll County go and besiege DeWitt, and they, give one of those, again, it's quasi-democratic, but anyway, it's democratic in the sense of mob rule thing where they warn the Mormons in DeWitt out, and they lay siege, and they won't let them in and out of the town, and they, essentially are armed and are doing everything they can through ultimately mob violence to get them to leave. And so ultimately they do. And so that's one of the very first things that happens in this conflict is is making sure that Mormons aren't going to be in Carroll County. And so once the Carroll Countyans have made that victory, then they are also, they think that they're going to be able to kick them out of Missouri altogether. And so they're kind of excited about that. So. Wow. Well, and I guess this kind of goes back to the same question. Essentially, there's no single point that we can say that the Missourians hated the Mormons for. I mean, you had the same narrative sold to you that I did to me, that it was just this religious persecution, that people hated the Mormons because they were Mormons. But really, it was an amalgamation of so many other social pressures. The fact that they were Mormons was just like, oh, these people believe in some kooky stuff, but they're still taking our land. They're still settling in places we don't agree with. They're still taking control of the Grand River and the Missouri River, and we don't want them to have control over that. So, I mean, all in all, it's a huge pot of nobody likes each other, essentially. Everybody was on everybody else's last nerves, from what I'm getting.
Well, it's your entire livelihood. So if you are, let's say, you have invested in, and you've actually been the person who's in control of a county like Carroll County, which maybe is 15 years old or something like that, and so you own the main store in Carrollton, and so then if suddenly though there's not that many people in Carroll County, I don't know what it is, maybe 3,000 people or something like that. If suddenly there's now 5,000 Mormons live in DeWitt, well, then the Mormons are going to vote, and then they're going to make DeWitt be the capital of, the county seat, and they'll control Carroll County. And every single thing that happens, Carrollton is no longer even going to be a concern. People will leave, they'll go, and they'll immediately move on to some new settlement so that they can be part of it. So essentially, you have this thing where you can become like you're the local major, in the militia. You're like, sorry that I'm spacing on your last name because it's long. Major Blanken. Looking, I can't find it.
Quadrisyllabic. Blankenagel.
Okay, and so then people are, so Major Blankenagel, and so you're like Colonel Sanders, right? So you're the local guy who is like everybody looks up to. You're you're major in the militia. You are a respected person in town. You're a lawyer. You can ultimately be elected to the state legislature. Then you're elected as a senator from that state. In other words, there's this dream of the local municipal elite, and none of that is anything if your town is passed by, right? So then you've invested in the thing that didn't go anywhere. And so those ghost towns are everywhere. So DeWitt was one of those ghost towns. Commerce was one of those ghost towns. Everybody was trying to get these things started up, and only every once in a while did like the town that you found becomes Chicago. There's only a few of them that become Chicago.
Well, and once Nauvoo became settled, it was only second in population to Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, in the state of Illinois, which was concerning for the people that were living. Well, for anybody that were not friendly to the Mormons living in Illinois, because you have two central places that are the centers of commerce in the entire state, and everything else, every other county nearby, maybe they might crop up to be the next Chicago, maybe not, who really knows. And it's, when your entire life is invested into one small plot of land and you're hoping that it'll appreciate just because of land values and demand from a flood of settlers coming in, I can understand how people were frustrated when those investments didn't ever come to fruition, or thanks to the Mormons, those investments turned around and bit them in the ass. It makes so much more sense when you add in the land point of this. Like when we actually examine, the land was actually an important piece to this, and it's this quintessential thing people have been fighting over for as long as we have history of. I think that adds a lot of extra context to this. So maybe we can kind of shift and talk about, instead of so much the land itself, maybe let's talk a little bit about the people that were involved. Because when they moved out to Far West, when Joseph and Sidney Rigdon moved to Far West, they had a little bit of a cleansing of the leadership out there. Of course, the Whitmers were excommunicated. Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated. These were founding members of the church. These were some of the first people baptized. These people saw Joseph dictating the Book of Mormon out of the hat. These people were scryers and diviners. These people were in league with Joseph Smith for a long time, but then they were just suddenly cut off. But this was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that there would be a cleansing of the leadership, essentially, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I think that part of it maybe is that through the whole early church period, there are these two nuclei. So every time that there's people that are gathering to Kirtland throughout the entire Kirtland period, we draw it on the map generally where we go New York, Kirtland, Missouri, Nauvoo, Winter Quarters, Salt Lake, or something like that. But what that misses is the fact that the entire Kirtland period, there are people settling in Missouri, right? And that there are more people in Missouri. And so Missouri, even though they're 800 miles apart or something like that, there is a second nucleus of the church that has its own presidency and everything like that. So the Whitmers are in that presidency. David Whitmer is the president of the Missouri Church, and so at a certain moment, for that whole time period, a lot of times when people were maybe already on the outs with the presidency and they just couldn't get along with Joseph Smith anymore, then they might have just moved to Missouri to get away from him and, okay, well, let's just work on something else for a while. And I think that was true for Oliver Cowdery especially. So Oliver Cowdery, who is one of the Whitmers because he's related, he's married David and John Whitmer's sister. And so he's part of that family. And so he, had left Kirtland, and because had a fight with Joseph Smith over Fanny Alger. And so Cowdery's interpretation of that, was that it's an affair. And so at that point, I think, and so this is my opinion or my speculation because it's about why did the loyalists to Joseph Smith act the way they did and functionally decapitate the Missouri church right when they got there. And I think it's because of preemptively, getting rid of dissent. So essentially they want to just make sure that they can tank down. They're not going to tolerate dissent anymore, because tolerating dissent, they might be thinking to themselves, is what led to the collapse of the church in Kirtland.
Right. Well, yeah, when there's a turd in the punch bowl, it makes everybody's punch taste like crap. So, I mean, I understand that, like a purging of the weak ones and people that wouldn't support polygamy, people that were most violently opposed to the Fanny Alger affair, people calling it a dirty, nasty, filthy scrape, and as in the case of Oliver Cowdery, I can see the need to cleanse them out of the leadership, especially given what happens in Nauvoo. Especially with how much the polygamy was ramping up in Nauvoo, these people that were violently opposed to it, the Whitmers and Cowdery, and I mean, I guess Sidney Rigdon was opposed to it, but he still stuck around in Nauvoo essentially. But he became, it seems, disconnected from the church somewhat once the Nauvoo years kick off.
Well, the fight though in Missouri is not over polygamy. So yes, the Cowdery is upset with Joseph Smith over Fanny Alger and that affair. That I don't think that people had the awareness of it yet as polygamy. There's no big group of polygamy insiders yet in Missouri where this rift happens. So you're identifying that as that rift that occurs later in the Nauvoo period when the let's say the doctrine or the teaching or the practice becomes way more widespread and Joseph Smith has actually started to bring a bunch of people into the know. But as of Missouri, I don't think that there is a bunch of people in the know.
I would agree because I know that we can't really necessarily point to Joseph having many extramarital affairs until the Nauvoo period. I forget when he was sealed to Louisa Beeman, but I think that was his first official polygamist wife. But I think that was in Nauvoo in the early 40s. But it seems like if there were, if Joseph, being the type of Joseph that I have constructed in my head, being a pussy hound, always trying to get as many women as possible, I can kind of see why it may not, if there were people that were opposed to him when he had this little Alger thing go on, that he might feel a little bit estranged, or they might become a little bit estranged from the prophet of the church. And he might sense that if I plan on, having more of these affairs, these people will always be a problem for me. Therefore, I need to get them out. Now, that's probably applying premeditation to something when he was just flying by the seat of his pants at the time. But that's kind of how I guess I'm formulating the Joseph in Far West doing this cleansing of the leadership.
Yeah, well, it could be, but I guess I feel like that's really that's way many steps ahead in terms of thinking. That's like a chess master, right? And so I think that they're much more concerned with the immediate fallout of having the kind of dissenters that they had in Kirtland, and not wanting to repeat that experience with people who are already maybe a little bit too they already feel like, well, we knew you when you were nobody kind of guys, and to already feel that maybe they maybe know, anyway, they're more autonomous than that he's willing to tolerate anymore. So.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's so this happened 1830, beginning 1838 through the middle of it. They basically cleansed out these people. The Whitmers, they never reconciled with Joseph Smith. Oliver Cowdery, I don't think that they ever shared any correspondence with Joseph Smith any time in their life after this. I could be completely wrong in that, but I think that at this point it was basically, I'm not affiliated with these people anymore. Is that correct?
Right. So yeah, they get kicked out even. So they get excommunicated first. Although I think David Whitmer, I'm not sure that he actually is formally excommunicated. I think that he has some kind of a procedure where he's withdrew from fellowship or something like that. But Oliver Cowdery certainly is formally excommunicated. And then the thing that happens fairly soon thereafter is the organization of this secret society that is collectively usually known as the Danites. And the Danites, one of their initial goals is to purge the society. They're going to have a perfect and pure church and state society in Far West now. And so they purge the dissenters. And so one of the, you were talking about the 4th of July sermon. The first one of these aggressive sermons is the Salt Sermon, which is essentially warning out the dissenters and telling them to go. And then that's followed up, which it's followed up with, real, very overt hints on the part by the Danites that, you're not safe here. You're going to get roughed up if you don't flee. So essentially the Whitmers including Oliver Cowdery, flee the county and lose all their property. So the
Smart
Whitmers, they say preserve their life, lose their property. And so the Whitmers locate and they live in Richmond the rest of their lives. So they move one county south and then they live in Richmond. Oliver Cowdery moves on. He goes back to Ohio where he becomes a lawyer. Ultimately, we don't know what he was thinking about with Joseph Smith. I speculate that he may have always thought that at some point or other that Joseph Smith would write to him, would forget, would reconcile, would apologize maybe, and he'd be able to come back or something like that. Whether or not but that never happened. There's no reconciliation, like you say, in their lifetime, and then Joseph Smith is killed. At that point, Oliver Cowdery's brother is busy investigating Strang's claims and has moved to Wisconsin, where Strang's headquarters is. And Oliver Cowdery relocates to Wisconsin, I guess, to potentially to investigate Strang's claims, which he decides are wanting. And so then he writes a letter to David Whitmer, his brother-in-law, and he says Strang has raised his banner and said that he's the successor. The 12 have taken their folks out, to the west and claim that they are the leaders. And he says, but to David Whitmer, he says, but the 12 have not the keys to lead the church. So the people who have the keys to lead the church are the people who called the 12, the 3 witnesses. And so specifically Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer. And so, but the problem, of course, was that neither one of them was in the church at the time. So then, having gone and done some consultation with some of the 12ites who were at the Missouri River, Oliver Cowdery's rebaptized into the movement. He then goes down to David Whitmer's house in Richmond, where he's possibly, we don't know, but anyway, they may be possibly planning. We don't know what they're planning. I speculate that because of his ideas, or at least the letter that he'd sent to David Whitmer about having the keys himself, they may have been planning to launch their own leadership bid, or maybe they'd be trying to negotiate with Brigham Young up for a position within his church. However, whatever it would be, we don't really know because he dies. So Oliver Cowdery dies at David Whitmer's house. His wife and his family, his children, become Whitmerites later. So, the trajectory there is kind of a Whitmer direction, but we don't really know what Oliver Cowdery would have done if he hadn't died. So.
Okay. So there are, so we understand the succession crisis. We've heard names thrown around, the Strangites, the Brighamites, the Rigdonites. But there were so many more than we can actually try and quantify. But let's maybe try and hit on some of the biggest ones that broke off and took a significant portion with them after Joseph's death. So, of course, we have the Brighamites, who eventually headed out to Utah in 1847, followed Brigham Young, settled in, in winter quarters, and then out to Utah. And then, of course, it was the main succession crisis seemed to be between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, because Sidney Rigdon was the only surviving member of the first presidency. And I think he took like 400 some odd people with him to go found the Rigdonite sect, which ended up disintegrating in 1849. But there's also Alpheus Cutler and James Strang and Joseph Smith III and William Smith and Lyman White. Like, we have a lot of extra people, so maybe we can spend 5 minutes on each of these people. Let's start with we talked about David Whitmer. Let's start with William Smith, the youngest brother of Joseph Smith, possibly off as rocker. We call him Crazy Willie in the timeline. He has his own little name. What happened with him?
Well, good old Crazy Willie then. Yeah. Crazy Willie has a lot of the same characteristics I think that his brother had, but he is just substantially less endearing. So I think that Joseph Smith would do stuff that, would get people really mad, and people would argue with him, and they would break up, but they would almost always get back or forgive him, or, they'd be able to get back together. William Smith didn't have that in him. Something about him, there was, the same ingredients, but the recipe had like a different, was cooked a little different or something like that. And it just ended up with a guy who was not liked generally by a lot of people.
Okay.
And so anyway, in the early church, there had been this idea that there's a lot of idea of lineage. So people felt that they were literal descendants of Ephraim, and when they were from the tribe of Ephraim, and they maybe were being gathered out of the Gentile population to regather Israel in the last days and that kind of thing. And another one of the verses of the Book of Mormon says that Joseph Smith is the descendant of Joseph in Egypt, which is he's the dad of Ephraim. And so there's this
Jewish, he was European.
Right.
European. Yeah. But that's a meaningless distinction. I mean, I guess I'm from Ephraim too, but I'm not Jewish either, but it doesn't matter. Never mind.
Well, they don't know any different, right? So anyway, this is a faith claim that's being made, and it's one that has appeal to people. And the Book of Mormon is scripture that includes a statement or a prophecy that Joseph Smith is a literal descendant of Joseph of Egypt through Ephraim, probably. Right. And so anyway, because of that, there is this idea then that he is of this sort of august lineage. And that's certainly a claim that William Smith makes. And so one of the things that we'd already had in the early church is this very strange and ambiguous, hard to understand role of presiding patriarch or presiding evangelist. The words are used interchangeably in the early church. So the presiding patriarch of the church, which Joseph Smith created as a job for his dad, so Joseph Smith Sr. And as a result of that...
Yeah, Joseph's father was the patriarch, the dad of the church, essentially. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And in doing that, though, he gave it all kinds of... He kept, his dad was no threat to him. He was an old man. He was no threat to him as a leadership threat. Right. And so Joseph would make all these extravagant claims about it being the highest office in the church and the most important one. But it's very, initially kind of a figurehead thing in that way. He dies, and when he dies, or at his deathbed, he appoints his oldest surviving son, Hiram, Joseph's older brother, to be presiding patriarch evangelist.
Which is a problem.
in doing... Well, I mean, it wasn't in that case because Hiram is a real loyal guy to Joseph Smith. And so Hiram is also invested in a little known or little understood office of the church, which is like vice president of the church or assistant president. And so he's part of the first presidency, but he's also got this very, very senior role in that. But he's also simultaneously presiding patriarch. And so exactly what that role is, again, it's very august, and so it's completely maybe a superior role to Joseph Smith's role, technically, if you believe the rhetoric, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also being passed not by the church, but it was being passed father to son, so within the Smith family through this lineage. So William Smith makes that claim.
And William Smith was the eldest surviving son after I guess it would be July of 1844, after Samuel Smith was, whether he died or was killed, Samuel Smith died, and William Smith was the eldest living surviving
son. The only surviving son. So the last of the Smith brothers to live is William. And so, like you said, the eldest surviving anybody who's now of Hiram's sons or Joseph's sons are just little kids still.
Yeah, of course.
So William essentially makes that claim now that he should be patriarch over the church, based on that lineage claim. And so he comes to Nauvoo
No, I was going to say, but if I'm not mistaken, from a pretty early time in the leadership, Brigham Young and William Smith weren't the best of friends. From what I remember, Brigham Young tried to get his brother or his cousin onto the Council of the 12, but then Joseph overrode that and said, I'm going to put in William Smith in the Quorum of the 12 instead. And I think that is kind of the genesis of troubles between Brigham Young and William Smith. And I think we see that played out because, well, William Smith eventually didn't become anything and Brigham Young became the president, the prophet of the church. That's my own personal interpretation.
Yeah, so they do not get, like you say, they don't get along, and they already didn't get along. But because of this, like you say, this precedent, and because Brigham Young's own position is quite shaky, in Nauvoo, when William, who's been away in the east presiding over the eastern missions of the church, while his wife has been sick, when he does get back to Nauvoo, Brigham Young recognizes that he has this claim to this office by right of lineage, and so then Brigham Young recognizes him as patriarch. But then they start to immediately quarrel over what the role of patriarch is. And so, like I say, William wants to make it very clear that he's patriarch over the church. Brigham Young says, no, you don't know, you're patriarch to the church. So it's like, it's a complicated thing about that. And so, yeah, you're patriarch to the church, not patriarch over the church, like William wants to say. Exactly. So anyway, it probably is patriarch of the church is what it should be. But anyway, Brigham Young wants to downgrade it even to just, a patriarch serving the church or whatever to the church. Right. So anyway, after not too long, they have it entirely out on the outs. And so Brigham Young excommunicates William from his organization. William ceases to recognize Brigham Young as having any authority. He's looking around. Maybe he's going to reorganize the church himself, with himself as patriarch over the church and president of the church. But around that time, there's this very interesting and also kind of rapidly successful alternative organization that is organizing around James Strang up in Wisconsin. So after kind of starting up his own church for a little bit, he then writes to Strang and vice versa, and he more or less says to Strang, so you recognize the fact that I'm patriarch over the church, right? And Strang's like, oh yeah, I totally get that. That's how I understand it to be. I'm the prophet, seer, revelator. I'm the president of the church, but you're a patriarch over the church. And Williams writes back and it's like, that's right. That's exactly how I get it. Wow. I understand too. Anyway, so they kind of agree to recognize each other in those roles, and William then relocates to Wisconsin, where Strang is,
as part of a
and joins that movement. Yeah. So he's now part of the Strangite organization.
Okay, I want to talk about James Strang, but I want to get a couple of these other less important people out, these less hinge pin people. So Lyman White, General, I call him
we're not
General
done with William Smith, though. I'm sorry. So the problem with it is, so William's not done. I mean, I should just finish his story real quick. So anyway, William is still secretly practicing polygamy on the Nauvoo style.
Oh, interesting.
And Strang initially here at this stage is still an opponent of polygamy. And so in finding it out, he kicks William out of his church, and they excommunicate each other. And at that point, William organizes his own Williamite church. So then there's a new organization that William makes a claim to, and it's based in Illinois. And William makes the very good argument that, when Jesus ascended into heaven, when he's no longer leading the church, it wasn't Peter, the head of the apostles, who's in charge of the church. The person who took over the church is actually James the Just, who is the brother of Jesus, who takes over. And so when Paul and Peter have a argument, they go to Jerusalem, where the head of the church, James the Just, deliberates between the two, and anyway, he's shown to be the head, right? Right. And so that argument is obviously self-serving for William, who should be leading the church, is what he's saying, not Brigham Young, right? And that's so anyway, so of course, yeah. And so anyway, he creates a church. He has a very august title by the end. So he's prophet, seer, revelator, translator, patriarch over the whole church.
And baker, throw baker in there too. I mean,
and butcher, baker, and candlestick maker over the whole church.
Okay, so I've never heard of the Williamites before. So what happened?
So he's still secretly practicing polygamy among them, and they find out and they kick him out. So essentially, he gets kicked out of his own church, and so that's the end of William. So
I love this guy, Crazy Willie, good guy.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So that's the end of William Smith, essentially, then, right?
Yeah. Well, he tries to do something. He tries to have a little thing where he gets together with Martin Harris later. They never have more than a dozen people together, I think, and then they fight. And ultimately, he sniffs around. He wants to try to join different churches, but he has to be given a very high office to do it. And ultimately, when the reorganization happens, they eventually let him in, although a lot of people don't want to because they know that he's been practicing polygamy.
Right.
And he's just accepted into the reorganization as a high priest, as he's never a patriarch or an apostle in the reorganization.
Okay, well, we'll get into the reorganization because and that's where I want our conversation to end, essentially. So let's get a couple of these other people out of the way briefly. Let's talk about Lyman Wight. Now, I've called him General Wight in the timeline because that's what he was. He was a general in the 1834 Zion's Camp March, and he was one of the more militant out of the various leaders in the church. So what happened with Lyman Wight after 1844?
So Lyman Wight, like you mentioned, he had been the general of the camp and was also really the main leader in Davies County, so the county that had Adam-on-Diamond. So they had and so as a result of that, he was a very, very core early leader, much more important than Brigham Young. And he was also older than Brigham Young. And so if he had just happened to have been named an apostle, he stayed in Missouri. But if he'd gone back to Ohio and been named an apostle, he would have certainly been the senior most apostle, and he would have been, Brigham Young we'd never heard from again, probably. But anyway, because that didn't happen, I think he never thought very highly of Brigham Young's claims or anything like that. Brigham Young, as far as he's concerned, is an upstart who really doesn't, have anything like the kind of, claims and stature and things like that Lyman Wight had. But he had been a member of the Council of 50, and since the Council of 50 is also organized by age, he's an important member. And part of the things on the Council of 50, he was authorized to deal with the Republic of Texas and negotiate a retreat from the Mormons if they had to flee Illinois to Texas.
There were a few places that the Mormons decided would be their stronghold, given that Nauvoo would collapse. I mean, there was like Canada, there was Utah territory, Mexico, Texas area. I mean, there were multiple places that were possibilities. So he was just kind of heads of one of these locations then.
Right. And so he was definitely sent, anyway, he was focused on Texas, which was probably the leading candidate at the time of Joseph Smith's death. But anyway, I mean, they're the only, and Texas is the only, it's only a kind of a quasi-republic, but anyway, the only thing that had sort of an actual functioning government, however legitimate we agree that Republic of Texas's government was. But the Council of 50 sent ambassadors to all of these different states, and for example, the U.S. government or Her Majesty's government, in England, or the Tsar, none of those people received the ambassadors, except for the Republic of Texas, which was willing to negotiate with the Mormons and potentially Sam Houston was potentially willing to give them this zone, which is between the Rio Grande and the Nueces, or whatever it is, the river that, is this border zone that was in dispute, right, between Texas and Mexico. I mean, Mexico was disputing whether Texas could exist at all, but especially the border was in dispute. And so that was maybe, on offer, that whole area, this border strip, as being an independent Mormon republic.
Wow, interesting. So Mormon land.
Yeah, Mormon land. And so Lyman Wight was committed to that. And so he wanted to take everybody to Mormon lands. And so he took everybody that was loyal to him to Mormon lands. And he established some very successful colonies outside of San Antonio. And for a while had pretty much the most successful little, a very successful little Mormon colony thing going down there. But
wow. Okay.
He didn't himself make a claim to leadership.
Okay. But they were disconnected from any of the other Mormon leadership, any of the other break-off sects. They were just kind of the Whiteites, I guess you would call them. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they're actually not even out of communion with anybody at first. So essentially, we think of these sects as like all being break-offs or anything like that. I would argue instead that the whole group of all Latter-day Saints are all kind of all together, but they have different competing center places and central organizations that are in competition with each other. But just because you have a branch, let's say, that you're meeting in southern Indiana, you aren't necessarily a Strangite or a Brighamite or a Whiteite. You are just a Latter-day Saint, and if Strangite missionaries come to you with the Strangite newspaper, you can probably let them preach. And then later, when a Brighamite missionaries come through, you let them preach.
We look back on this time and we make these these solid lines of delineation between the Rigdonites and the Marxites and the Whitmerites and the Strangites, but it was much more amorphous and less well defined back then. They were just Mormons, essentially.
Yeah, it would be very undefined because right now we think of these lines as being very stark because the LDS Church owns this entire corporation. It owns all this property. It owns the building you meet in. So in other words, all of that is very legally defined. The headquarters had nothing on you in that time. So there's just these rival things. So when does Lyman White breaks formally with Brigham Young over when Brigham Young creates a new first presidency? And so so at that point he doesn't, because he believes that.
And we're talking 46. Yeah,
47. Whenever he hears the news.
Okay.
Whenever it is, exactly. It's after that point, in other words. And part of the reason for Lyman White's concern is because he was present in Liberty Jail and other occasions when Joseph Smith had given special blessings to his son, Joseph III, that he would be the successor. In other words, that he would be prophet of the church at some time. So that was Lyman White's belief of who the successor would be and should be. And so as a result of that, he never made a claim to be the leader of a Whiteite church or anything like that. He's simply leading colonies of the Latter-day Saint movement in preparation ultimately for when there's going to be a new successor, which will be Joseph III.
Wow.
And so as a result of that, even though these guys have a very high Nauvoo theology and practice down there in Texas, so they have their little temple or more or less an endowment house where they're doing endowments and they are doing sealings for plural marriage. They're living polygamy down there in the Texas frontier. Nevertheless, almost all of the Whiteites end up going into the reorganization because they have this understanding that Joseph III should be the successor. So.
Wow. Okay. So that was essentially what, Lyman White's contribution. So he wasn't exactly defined as a separate alternative to Brigham Young. He was just a dude that helped colonize Mormon Texas, essentially, from what I'm gathering.
And one of his direct descendants, John White, is the president of the Presidents of 70 for Community of Christ.
That's okay. Same White then for the Community of Christ, not for the Utah LDS Church. Okay, interesting.
Right, the Whiteites almost all joined. All the Whiteites mostly joined the reorganization. So.
Okay, so let's kind of move and briefly talk about Alpheus Cutler because I don't remember reading much about this guy. Then what happened with Alpheus Cutler then?
So Cutler is one of the leaders of the pioneer camp going across Iowa. And so when they settle winter quarters, one of the places in the winter quarters is called Cutler's Camp. And Cutler has been one of an early leader. He's like he's the Mason or the chief Mason for the Nauvoo Temple. And he is also a member of the Council of 50. And because he's an old guy, he's one of the senior members of the Council of 50. He likewise does not, he followed Brigham Young and the 12 across Iowa before there's this new first presidency that Brigham Young organizes. But again, in doing that, he feels that Brigham Young has now, abrogated his idea that originally he thought probably again that Joseph III would become the successor. And so he refuses to go any further west. And at a certain point, they reorganize their church as the Church of Jesus Christ. And they make a settlement, a number of settlements, but one of them is Manti, Iowa, which is sort of in the southwest corner of the state of Iowa along the Missouri, or near the Missouri River, so that when the end times come, which Alphaeus Cutler firmly believes, like most early members, is going to be very, very soon, he'll just have to get on a riverboat and go down to Independence, and he doesn't want to have to go across the plains and back and everything like that. So essentially the Cutlerites...
just drop down the river and you're there. That makes sense. Right.
And so the Cutlerites, again, have one of these movements, which is high Nauvoo theology. Initially, they are practicing polygamy, although they decide at a certain point when they become separated from the people in Utah, they actually stop the practice and they erase anything that they'd even been doing it. So they tear it all up and they suppress the documents and memory that they'd even been polygamists. And in fact, Cutlerites today are very much, as a faith claim, believe that they weren't polygamists, but anyway, the record is pretty clear that they were. But anyway, so then they also maintain the Nauvoo endowment, and they are the only non-Brighamite group that still exists that practices the Nauvoo endowment.
Wow, interesting. I didn't realize that he actually... I mean, how many people really followed him? I mean, are we talking, 2 families, or are we talking, a few hundred people actually that followed Cutler?
It would be in the hundreds of people at some point.
Wow.
They had at least 3 settlements in southern Iowa. There's a bunch of people. At some point or other, whoever it is, Orson Hyde, I think, is the Brighamite leader in Council Bluffs. And he writes back to Utah. He says what he calls Indian Cutleritism is a real threat here, as a lot of people want to stay in Iowa, and they are looking to Cutler because they don't want to go to this rotten cricket-infested desert. They like Iowa for farming, So and Cutler's saying you don't have to go, and this is a big threat, So he had a bunch of different followers, and again, one of the things that happened is, because of this idea that Cutler maybe also had that eventually Joseph III would be the successor, all of Cutler's descendants joined the reorganization when Josephite missionaries got to Manti, and almost all the Cutlerites did join, but some of them fled to Minnesota, where they established a new kind of base and kind of way on the frontier, in the northern frontier. The reorganization missionaries found them up there too and converted almost all their next generation of people. And then ultimately just a handful of them made it back to Independence, where there's about 6 of them left. But more or less everybody who's a descendant of Cutler, who's in the restoration of tradition, no descendants of Cutler are Cutlerites. They're in the community of Christ. And so I know one of Cutler's descendants, and her family just recently gave, Alphaeus Cutler's War of 1812. He was a veteran of the War of 1812. His sword to it's now in the church archives, so to be preserved.
Oh, wow, interesting. Okay, so I want to move to talk about Strangites, and I think that probably leads us into a good discussion about the reorganization, because Strang and some of the remaining Smiths, I know Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith III were kind of in cahoots with Strang for a little while. Can we kind of talk about how the Strangites, what they kind of did, and then how the reorganization came about after that?
So Joseph III and Emma and Paul and that family, they had nothing to do with Strang. Mm-hmm. Strang would have loved for Joseph III or Emma to have joined the church, to have joined his church or acknowledged him as a successor, but that never happened.
Oh, okay.
Lucy, and other members of the Smith family had at least had their names signed to a pro-Strang letter on behalf of William, who was kind of the surviving son and the leader of the broader Smith family. So William definitely became a Strangite, and he went up there. And so, in some extent or other, other people like Lucy were supportive of what William was doing, and were looking hopefully to the Strangite headquarters as maybe providing an old age pension and a house for her and things like that. And so there was so she would have been connected with them through William, but Emma and her kids never had any association with Strang.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's walk through Strang and what he did, because I think he was one of the more charismatic and goofy of the people that were possible successors. I mean, he basically just showed up and was like, "Hey, I got a revelation that said I'm the new president, so follow me." Basically, from what I understand. So let's give a little bit of background on Strang.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that he's goofy, but anyway, I think that, I mean, he definitely is a very, like you say, he's charismatic, but in a different way probably than Joseph Smith. He's very intelligent. He's very, like Joseph Smith, he's very creative and he's an intelligent guy, but is much more, has much more education.
Oh.
And would have had a more sophisticated appeal that Joseph Smith was kind of trying for in later time period. He was aspiring towards, but he was still, there would still be rough around the edges in a lot of different ways. I mean, Strang is still not like a part of the sophisticated elite, but he is better educated. He, like you say, one of the arguments that he makes is that even though he's quite a new member of the church, he makes this argument, well, if you were, let's say you're in a branch and you're on an island and you're cut off and you have, you only have like an elder and you have a couple priests and a deacon. If that elder died, could the priests get together? Could one of the priests ordain another one of the priests to be an elder, so you'd still have elders again?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what do you do? Really?
I mean, obviously not, right? You obviously can't.
Yeah, who has the authority to?
Right. How could that priest create an elder?
Yeah.
So how could it be possible for somebody, like even an apostle or anybody, to ordain somebody to be the prophet? And this is very clear, that the prophet is higher ranked than the apostle, right?
Right. Well.
So that's his argument.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so that argument was compelling to a lot of people. He said, where did Joseph Smith get his authority? He got it from an angel who ordained him. And on the very same day that Joseph Smith was killed, an angel appeared to me and ordained me to be prophet, seer, revelator, and translator in the church. And I have a lot of different ways that I can show it. And one of the ways I can show it is we found new plates. And here are new plates. And here are witnesses who've seen the plates. Actually, you can see the plates.
He was a revelator, right? I mean, he came up with a lot of his own proprietary writings that sound similar to, thus saith the Lord and stuff. Like, he was essentially the next extension of Joseph Smith as far as these prophetic revelations go, right?
Right. So he adds, and he ultimately translates or proposes or gives or presents to his church an additional book of scripture called the Book of the Law of the Lord, which is a translation of the brass plates, that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So essentially, it is the law of ancient Israel, and so it is an expansion of the Ten Commandments and a restoration of the Ten Commandments that kind of shows, that all of the dispensations ultimately, ancient Israel and Christian and Mormon are all together, and so it is actually it's a very, very Mormon book, but it is not had by any Mormons other than the Strangites. So.
Wow. So, I mean, he's like an 1840s Christopher Nemelka kind of guy, basically.
Christopher, yeah. But Christopher Nemelka's not a compelling writer, I don't think. So, I mean, at least to me, I don't know. So, I mean, the Book of the Law of the Lord is actually pretty interesting reading, and Strang not only provided the text, but he actually wrote an inspired commentary of it. So it's actually a very, very interesting book. Anyway.
And didn't he have plates of some sort as well?
So there are two sets of plates. The first plates were the Vori plates, and so those are the thing that people would have been aware of at first, and those are plates that are merely more or less an ancient writer is more or less predicting that the place where Strang is, which is the city of Burlington, Wisconsin, but it's a gathering place which Strang called Vori, based on this ancient text from an ancient writer that predicted that one day the Vori plates, and that one day a great prophet would emerge there. in a time of crisis kind of thing. And so that obviously is predicting James Strang. And so
I love this guy.
So the Vori plates more or less just predict Strang is coming, in the same way that the Book of Mormon has a portion where it predicts that Joseph Smith, will emerge in the future. And so in that same way, they kind of have that function. But it's a very tiny text, and it's a very brief text. It's just a couple plates. There was an actual physical artifact that thousands of people, including non-members of the church, saw. So there really was a physical artifact in this case that could be observed. And it doesn't exist anymore, or has been lost. And then Strang published a translation of that.
So, but I mean, this is I'm of the opinion that Joseph manufactured a set of plates that people actually hefted around in this box, out of tin or out of some available metal. Is this what happened with Strang, in your opinion? Did he manufacture these plates?
Well, so the difference between the plates that, as we have the testimony of the two different sets of plates, is probably nobody actually physically saw Joseph Smith's plates.
Yeah.
So the golden plates are not to be looked at.
Right.
And so even when they're talking, even the testimony of the 8 witnesses and things like that, they're talking about hefting them, like you say, inside the box.
Yeah.
And same thing, if people are talking about feeling them, it's feeling them under a
cloth.
Under a cloth, if they actually are even doing that. And so that's not something that anybody is physically within their physical eyes looking upon.
Okay.
The descriptions we have of the Vori plates, including by people who are completely not associated with any of the churches or anything like that. There's a local reporter who's the guy who he's like the guy who invented the QWERTY typewriter.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he actually has seen them. He wrote a big account of them and everything like that. And he doesn't think very much of them. He thinks, like you say, it's a little bit of tin.
Right. And so not just people that were members of Joseph Smith's family. Right.
Right. No, anybody. And so we can, just based on these reports, we can, I think, fairly credit them as having a physical artifact existed, which is essentially a very small piece of like 3 or 4, whatever it is, 4 or 5 sheets of metal that are pulled together with a wire, and they have however many there were of them, but anyway, not very many, and they have a little bit of writing scratched into them, and we have a facsimile of what that looks like. There's also like 2 pictures.
Wow. So in your opinion, did Strang concoct these, or where did he get these from, in your opinion, or out of your knowledge?
I don't think that, myself, or my own belief on that is that I don't see how there'd be any other place where they came from other than Strang creating.
Okay. That's fair.
They're not, but obviously for Strangites, they are an ancient artifact. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, so Strang, eventually he led people out to what was called Beaver Island, and that's where he founded his that's where essentially it became his Strangite stronghold, and he practiced polygamy out there, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so ultimately when he translated the Book of the Law of the Lord, that includes the law that allows for polygamy.
Oh.
And so he openly was practicing polygamy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then he has the same thing where he's killed by, just like Joseph Smith, he's martyred by non-members or former members and non-members who kind of form a mob. They assassinate him, and they dispossess all of the Strangites who are on Beaver Island. They're all collected up. They're separated from their property. They're put onto steamboats and dropped off in small groups all around the edges of Lake Michigan, all around this big Great Lake. Just destitute and in tiny groups, so they can hardly even reconstitute themselves. So.
That's horrible. That's absolutely horrible. I know that the Mormons themselves didn't undergo such an odd version of an actual breaking up of the church, but this was like a literal breaking up of the Strangites. And this happened in what, 55 or something? Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's like 50. I have to look it up. Like 56, something like that, like you're saying. And it's in some ways, it's these are people in a lot of cases who had also been kicked out of Missouri, right? So they're the same. They've gone through all these things, but it's by far and away, in terms of the crises that any of the churches face. Here you have both the succession crisis and getting kicked out, but even in this case with nothing, at least in when you're kicked out of Missouri, it was whatever you could carry or put in a wagon or something like that. Same thing in Illinois. It was a long process where they were able to sell as much as they could and bring as much as they could. In this case, they were just with whatever they're wearing and they're dispossessed of everything. Never got anything back.
Wow. Okay, so I feel like Strang, interestingly enough, he, I think, is one of the more charismatic and I think one of the more compelling and fascinating people out of all of these. He had the most whimsical version of the succession, being just an angel appeared and ordained me. So, but I see the arguments behind it. But I want to kind of talk about the reorganization because I think that's probably the largest competing break-off sect. Let's say maybe Brighamite is the largest competing break-off sect in comparison to the RLDS Church and what is now called the Community of Christ. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of the timeline of how the reorganization happened?
So, as I mentioned, a bunch of the different rival organizations, including even Brigham Young, had said to different people at different times, well, that, we know who will maybe be a successor, or that boy will have his place someday, but if we mention it now, he'll get killed,
okay.
This kind of thing. So there were lots of different, yeah, exactly. So there's lots of different blessings, including Joseph III's patriarchal blessing from his grandfather, and a blessing in Liberty Jail, a blessing in the upper room of the Red Brick Store, and then finally the last kind of public act that Joseph Smith did in Nauvoo before leaving was giving another blessing to Joseph III before going to Carthage, where he's killed. So there's a lot of different witnesses of people having the idea that one day Joseph III is going to be, prophet of the church anyway. And so that was in the back of people's minds. Okay. But in the meantime, like you say, he's an 11-year-old kid. He and his mom and their family, they leave for a little bit of time when Nauvoo is really, really unsafe. But essentially, they end up just staying in Nauvoo and not joining or not being affiliated with any of the different rival organizations. But a lot of them were very keen on having him join, and so they understood that there was a legitimacy war on between the different factional leaders and the different organizations, and anybody who would get Joseph III, who, ultimately when he grows up looks a lot like his dad, and people would remember his dad. And anyway, so there was a lot of interest in getting him to come out to Salt Lake, or getting him to go to Beaver Island, or any of the other different competing factions. So some of the churches, like we mentioned, like Lyman White's church, like William Smith's church, like Alphaeus Cutler's church, even Strang actually talked about, also, had prophesied that maybe Joseph III would eventually be his successor, kind of thing. So the different people were looking towards that. But then by the time, like the late 1850s had kind of rolled around, almost all of these competing factional leaders, except Brigham Young in Utah, everybody else had kind of collapsed on themselves in different ways. So Lyman White died. James Strang was martyred. Cutler had become, he was already old, right? So, and now he'd become extremely infirm and was a lanolin addict and was morbidly obese and couldn't leave his house anymore. So his organization was not, he wasn't a vigorous leader anymore. A lot of the other ones had collapsed too. Zadoc Brooks, the Thompsonites, all the other different leaders. The Rigdon collapsed almost immediately. Yeah. So all of those different organizations had pretty much fizzled. And so the people who were left in the Midwest who had branches, their branch may have been at different times affiliated with the Strangite Church or any of the other churches, they're kind of left leaderless. And so in the 1850s, they have organized together and decide that they want to wait until Joseph Smith III or somebody, one of his brothers, kind of emerges to lead the church. And so they start holding, they continue to have their branches and they continue to be, like in regular congregational life. But they hold conferences, general conferences of the church, hoping for that kind of day. And so when William Marks, who had been just a very close friend of the Smith family, especially Emma, and had been the state president in Nauvoo, the president of the presiding high council in Nauvoo, when he, having been a Strangite, having been a Thompsonite, having been a seeker, when he joined with this new organization of the church in the Midwest, that gave it a legitimacy for Emma and her kids. And so he said, this is something you guys should look into. So they had tried to recruit, given the fact that their belief of this group was that Joseph III would eventually be the leader of it. They had tried to get him to join, but he hadn't been interested, and he told them at the time, I'm not going to just go and become a prophet because you are inviting me to say so. I would have to feel called by God to do it.
Okay.
And so
is this where we see so many letters surfacing of various people, whether it was William McClellan or whoever, writing to Joseph Smith III talking about Joseph?
Yeah, a lot of people then would write to him afterwards.
Wow.
They wrote him beforehand to try to get him to join their movement. So McClellan, at some point or other, was leading he was leading more or less his own McClellan Whitmerite church. So he was running a church in Kirtland which he claimed that David Whitmer was the president of, but the Whitmers weren't particularly aware of it. And so anyway, so McClellan, and they ultimately repudiated it. But anyway, so McClellan at different times was trying to get something going, and he would have, he was corresponding with Emma and like you say, Joseph III eventually. So I don't know exactly when, whichever letter it would be, but after Joseph III, then he comes to this conference of the reorganization, Illinois, Amboy, Illinois, on April 6, 1860. He announced to the people that were assembled there that he came by a power not his own, that he had prayed and he had felt justified in taking his father's mantle, assuming his father's mantle as prophet of the church.
And of course, I assume that the people were just elated to have this happen, right? Because it's like, we've been waiting for the prophet's son to assume his heirship, and this is it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so as a result of that, then it just took off like wildfire. Anybody who was left in the Midwest, pretty much joined with the reorganization real fast. And that's why from just a handful of people, a couple hundred people maybe at that conference, pretty much by the 1870s, pretty much all of the old members who weren't in Utah now kind of became affiliated with the reorganization. Most of them, not everybody. So there's a couple people then who they don't gather in. So some of the last people who were still remaining Strangites, so there remains essentially one congregation that doesn't affiliate. Almost everybody. Because Strang didn't appoint a successor, and because the different Strangites kind of were looking forward to maybe when Joseph III would come forward, almost everybody who was a Strangite became a reorganized, the Josephite.
Wow.
And same thing, all the Cutlerites, all the Whiteites, all the Thompsonites, all the people who were in Zadok Brooks Church, all the Williamites. So almost all of those people joined the reorganization. An exception being an early branch, a couple branches in Illinois that were part of the reorganization conference. They end up deciding not to stay affiliated with it. Wow. And so those guys, under the leadership of Granville Hedrick, they reorganized their own church, which we kind of call the Hedrickites, and they moved back to Independence where they bought the temple lot, and then now they're the central Hedrickite church is the Church of Christ temple lot.
The temple lot, yes, and they owned that temple lot. That was a Joseph Smith revelation that the founding of the temple will be here, and there has yet to be a temple. It's just literally an open grass lot. That's it.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, they were going to try to build it in the 1920s, but then they weren't able to. So like you say, there's that group, and then the last remaining apostle that had been in Sidney Rigdon's church also organized a church called the Church of Jesus Christ in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. So we call them William Bickerton, so we call them the Bickertonites. Okay. And so those guys stay, outside of the reorganization, but largely then by the time you get into let's say the turn of the 20th century, most of the people are either in the LDS church headquartered in Salt Lake or Community of Christ, which ultimately is headquartered in Independence, Missouri.
I find that so remarkable that, once this 1844 succession crisis happens, it's basically just a grenade going off of all of these different sects that consider themselves believers in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith. explode. They break off. They go to their own small geographic areas and found their own little followings of anywhere from maybe a couple of families to as many as it sounds like quite a few hundred has followed Strang, or maybe the Cutlerite.
Thousands of Strangites.
Thousands of Strangites. I mean, that's remarkable. And then all it takes is just one person, Joseph Smith III, that in many people's eyes had the rightful claim to the throne, coming along and charismatically saying, hey, I've been ordained, I am now the prophet of the church, and all of these people fall into line right behind him. Maybe it's just a Smith thing that they have about them, but I'm just amazed that we see this, this explosion of all these different religious sects, and then they all finally fall in line and come together under the leadership of one powerful leader. And I guess reorganization is probably the best word for it. I mean, it's a collective of all of these ideas coming together and embodying what I assume all of these people were trying to do in the first place, which was follow the rightful heir to the throne, which was, well, Joseph's son, who was 11 at the time of Joseph's death. So that's just so remarkable. When did this reorganization become the Community of Christ?
The name change took place, was voted at World Conference in the year 2000, and then it officially took place in 2001.
2001, so very recent history, since it was changed from the RLDS to the LDS Church.
To the Community
of Christ. I'm sorry, I mixed that up. So So growing up in the LDS Church myself, maybe you can speak on this a little bit as well. I was always taught like the RLDS, they're the inferior ones. Like they don't have all the cool stuff. They don't have all the property. They don't live in Utah. They didn't follow Brigham Young. They were the weird ones of the group. Were you kind of sold that same narrative, and kind of like how does that play out today in your opinion?
Well, when I was a kid, I really had very little awareness of the RLDS Church. So, like you say, there's definitely something going. There is this church that exists, and so I saw one as a kid, and I think I asked my mom, "Well, what is that?" And I don't know. I mean, I kind of just have a vague memory of being told, that those are a bunch of very confused, dim-witted people or whatever, something like, I don't know what it would be, But anyways,
the redheaded stepchild.
Yeah, right? And so in terms of but when your podcast continues on chronologically and you get out to Utah under Brigham Young's leadership and things like that, I think you'll eventually get to the point where you think, well, not having Brigham Young is probably quite a good thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But anyway, so there's definitely the church that doesn't have Brigham Young, and we certainly don't have all the property. So there's a lot more money in the Mormon church. So
don't have the tens of billions of dollars of assets, right, and the multi-billion-dollar income from tithing, because I understand that the Community of Christ doesn't require 10% of your income, of your gross income before taxes, right?
It's just what you feel called to give. So as a result of that, church doesn't have any money. So it's also, we don't call CEOs and business guys to be apostles. Instead, we call people who have divinities degrees and theologians and stuff like that. And guess what? They don't know how to run businesses either. So the church is not run like a business. It's run like a theology institute. So.
Really remarkable. Yeah, it might be weird to have somebody be your bishop that is actually trained in counseling. Wow. Imagine that, instead of being a dentist. But I guess that's kind of the narrative that I was always sold, was like I guess I didn't really run into much about the RLDS Church, but I understood them just to be the stepchild that doesn't have all of the cool stuff. They don't have all the huge shopping malls and the Hawaii theme park, basically. I think that's probably a failing on the perspective of the Mormons themselves, as a whole body together, saying one church is true, the other one is not true, because they have more followers, or they have more assets, more liquid cash, whatever.
Yeah, that argument as an apologetic is, then the true church is very clear what the true church is. The one and only true church is the church that has 1.6 billion people in it and owns, all the assets of the world. Is the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which so yeah. So they've got the money, they got the people, everything.
Yeah, it's an absolutely absurd argument. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. So we've been on the phone for 2.5 hours now. It's amazing how much time can fly when you're just I'm so fascinated by your extent of knowledge in this stuff, and I cannot stop picking your brain, John. You're an extremely informed individual, and obviously, you know the history. You've been studying it a lot more than I have. You've read many more books on this than I have, and I like to hopefully this doesn't have a negative connotation, but I like to leverage your knowledge, and hopefully the listeners can appreciate you coming on here and sharing your extreme wealth of knowledge, even if it was just barely scraping the tip of the iceberg at this point, because I mean, we skipped over so much. Like, there's each point that we were talking on could be blown up into a 2-hour segment in and of itself. But that being said, I know that currently you follow the Community of Christ, and you are very tightly affiliated with it. You work, or you previously worked with their historical department, and you are consistently working on books and publishing in relations to Mormon history and the Community of Christ. Can you kind of give us maybe, a 5-minute sales pitch on what the Community of Christ is today? If I, being a not member, walk into a Community of Christ church, what am I going to experience?
Well, it would depend on which one you walked into. So the Community of Christ is very much unlike the LDS Church. What the LDS Church is has a very solid program, and it's kind of prides itself on any ward house all around the world is doing the same, has the same floor plan, is doing the exact same thing. It's all on message with each other. You're only teaching out of manuals. The appointment of the bishop is from the stake, I guess, which is appointed from the region, which is appointed from the apostles, or whatever. However it goes, where it all is capstoned with the one leader, right?
Yeah, it's the McDonald's of Christianity, essentially.
Yeah. So Community of Christ is quite different. Its organization comes out of that. I mentioned out of like that branch organization. So essentially, it's, as opposed to being the heir of the headquarters. The headquarters, Brigham Young took control of it and took it off to Utah. The people that were left that became the reorganization are the branches that were everywhere, and so the congregational level is where it has a lot of its own control. And so I'm pastor, which is in the early church, the leaders of the branches were the presiding elder, the branch president, which was also called a pastor in the early church, not bishop. Mm-hmm. So bishop was the financial officer, and that changed on the Pilgrim Trek West. And when and ward is a geographical term, and so when an actual civic ward, of an actual city, is what the original word means. And that was because there's no separation of church and state in Utah. The area in which you go to a congregation is your ward, and that's where that comes from. That wasn't the case in the early church. The early church was branches, or that's what we say here, branches or congregations. And the congregation doesn't have a geographical limit. You don't have to go to one or the other. You go to whatever congregation you want to. There's usually not so many congregations, but let's say if you live in Independence, you've got 50 choices which congregation you might go to, and you just pick. You don't have to anyway. And ultimately the congregation has its control over its own budget and everything else. So we're about to have our annual business meeting, which would be like ward conference, but branch conference, congregation conference, and we vote on precisely what we're going to do as a congregation. Every voting member is in charge of that, and that also includes deciding who is pastor. So it's it's not appointed from without. It's the common consent of the people from inside the congregation. And so the congregations can be quite different.
That's essentially what the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, tries to do, where it says, those who vote to sustain this person, those opposed. So it's much more democratic than the actual LDS Church is, but it's still embodying that same kind of ideal, right?
Well, yeah, it's not. But it's not just the people from the stake have appointed this person. Are you going to say yes or no? And you have to kind of say yes. In this case, it's pretty much who can you dragoon to get to be in charge of this thing? Who's dumb enough to put their hand up and saying, okay, I'll be pastor, more or less, but it's handled, that's handled on the local level. So, one of the things that you get in coming to a Community of Christ congregation is that we've taken that by common consent portion pretty seriously. We've also taken the not having a creed portion fairly seriously. So we have what we call principles of faithful disagreement. So people can pretty well have their beliefs be all over the place, and we just have a where we are respectful of each other's beliefs, as opposed to you all have to believe this set of articles of faith or any other kind of thing like that. And so people are kind of all over the place in that way too. That's why it's hard for me to describe what it would be like if you walked into any particular congregation, because they can be all over the place.
Which I think is probably, that's something that bodes for it as opposed to against it. Some people do like to walk into a church and know exactly what it's going to be like. I mean, the layout of almost every LDS church is exactly the same. Like the similarities are absolutely remarkable, and I think the analogy of calling it the McDonald's of Mormonism is it's so fitting in so many ways, because every little thing is scripted down to the very tightest point, and no matter what happens in the church, you know what is going to happen after that. Whereas I think that if you're going to be in gathering together with a small number of the people that are in your community, why follow a set of rules? Like, let's just come together and talk and enjoy each other's company. Like, that sounds like so much more inviting than the LDS church in and of itself. And for people that are looking for a church outside of the LDS church that still holds to some of the same beliefs, and maybe a family-centric doctrine, it might be possibly a good escape for them. Because I know when people leave the LDS church, oftentimes they don't have a safety net. So, if there's this sense of community that the people can still relish in and know that these people believe in similar beliefs that I have, but they're just, kind of a nuanced version of it, that might be exactly what some people are looking for.
Sure. And there have been all kinds of people who feel that way, right? So there's a lot of people, for whatever reason, let's say maybe some of your listeners, as you have been going through this kind of deconstruction of the institutional LDS churches narrative of the history, and now you're finding all these points of disconnect. So you have a church that kind of insists on historical claims, forwards them all the time, and then now as you do the research yourself, you find the actual history to be quite at odds with those claims. So that can be a disturbing thing. So if you, in Community of Christ, the church doesn't make historical claims, we're not claiming in any way to be the one and only true church or something like that based on having authority. That's not one of our claims at all. And in fact, we have this thing called the principles of history, which include things like, one, that the church doesn't make any historical claims, and two, that you should do your own research and find out, and read the best sources and become versed in this stuff, make your own decisions.
So you're telling me that there isn't going to be a Community of Christ apostle that's holding up an iPhone and saying this is kind of what Joseph used? You're not going to see that?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I mean, it sounds actually really inviting. The John Whitmer Historical Association, I know that they hold conferences every year, and that's kind of like, if you want to dive into some serious heavy Mormon history, you go to Sunstone or you go to the John Whitmer Foundation, or John Whitmer Association Historical Conference. Like, those are the places you go, from what I understand. And I say that's great. I mean, embrace the history. It's a rich, vibrant, and beautiful history of the church, and there's no reason to run away from it. I just find it so appalling that the LDS church in and of itself finds the need to reconcile their history with their beliefs. I guess out of fear that it will chase people off if they come to really understand the church's history. But I would say that the Community of Christ is probably living proof that the LDS Church could embrace its history as being what the history is and still continue to be the LDS Church and continue to have tens of millions of billions of dollars in assets. So all of that being said, John, this has been an absolute pleasure in talking with you. I mean, I can't get enough of your knowledge here. I'm going to have you on in the near future to continue talking about some of the history that we've discussed in some deeper detail today. But if people want to find you online or find some of your work or your books, where is it that people can find you?
Well, I mean, I podcast very regularly on Infants on Thrones, so that's one of your fellow stations, I guess. And
absolutely good show over there.
I think, I mean, I don't know. I don't have it all gathered together. So I'm pastor at the Toronto congregation. That's at torontocongregation.com. I don't know. I don't know how you find me. You can find me on Facebook.
You know what? That is actually a great way to do it right there, right off the bat. If people want to listen to John's voice, go to Infants on Thrones. I can't imagine that there's anybody listening to this show that doesn't listen to Infants on Thrones, because it's an amazing show, especially their parodies. Oh my God. But John, he's published a fair number of books, or was a co-writer on a fair number of books. And those will all be listed in the show notes. And of course, there will be a link for Infants on Thrones in the show notes as well. Just in case people want to listen to more of that sultry, smooth voice that is packed full of Mormon history. Some great locations to find John. But John, thank you so much for coming onto the show, and I look forward to having you on in the future.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Likewise. And that was it for my discussion with John Hamer. If you want to find him, you can check the show notes for any contact information or projects that he has done or is currently working on, as well as just listen to Infants on Thrones. I cannot possibly think that there's anybody listening to the show that doesn't listen to Infants on Thrones. He comes onto that show occasionally to just talk Mormonism, but this conversation was a fair amount longer than most of the other discussions that I have on this show, and I could have broken it up into two separate episodes, but there just didn't seem like a good fracture point to do that. Everything was so internally reliant on things that we were discussing before, so this hopefully wasn't too long of a discussion, and we hopefully kept it moving well enough. But the main reason why I enjoy inviting Mormon historians on to the show is because I feel like I can just pick their brain constantly, and I can get to the bottom of some questions that I've had, and they offer a fair amount of context and perspective to the things that I'm studying, to the books that I'm reading that only talk about, one small aspect of a certain point in the timeline. Like just finishing Sidney Rigdon book by Richard Van Wagner. It talks about everything in the Mormon timeline from Sidney Rigdon's perspective, but there's so much that it leaves up to question that I don't understand. And that's what is so nice about talking to people that have already read all of these books that are on my to-read list. They can add that sense of insight to what I'm doing. They can put all of the pieces together and zoom out and say, this is the big picture. This is how the land speculation in Missouri affects what was going on in settlement in Nauvoo. This is, David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery being excommunicated in 38 plays into the larger Strangite and Schism crisis later on in the timeline. It's just absolutely fascinating. So I hope this wasn't too arduous of an episode to get through. It was an absolute joy to record this with John. I had so much fun talking deep Mormon history with him. So that being said, this episode has been long enough. We're going to do Patreon and listener mail segment next episode, and that will be a conversation episode, hopefully, as well. It may or may not be a historical episode. I still have to hammer down the guest that I have in mind for it. All in all, that's the end of this episode. I do appreciate you all sticking in for the entirety of the episode. It was quite a monster, but I feel like I learned so much from John, and hopefully everybody shares that same experience that I had. It was just an extremely enlightening conversation. That being said, I need to close down the episode for the evening, but before doing that, I need to thank a few people. First off, start out with Demonista for running the Facebook page. Also need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in this show with his permission. For his music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. I need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show. For his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail to be played on the show, whether it's talking about your story or something that's screwed up on the show, it's 864-625-3366. goes straight to voicemail. You can leave it there. I'd like to thank all of the patrons who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and for everybody that gets in touch through nakedmormonism@gmail.com. I love having correspondence with all of you. That being said, please do check out the video that was posted up this week. It was my video presentation at Sunstone Symposium on the life of Sidney Rigdon. I had a really good time presenting it. There will be a link for it in the show notes. That was essentially last week's episode. It just took a little while to get up and get the video edited down and taken care of and everything to put together, but it is online on Patreon and YouTube. You can find it on there. There will be links for it in the show notes here. Most of all, of course, I need to thank all of you magnificent listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. As if this episode hasn't been long enough already. Thanks for sticking in for after the credits. Occasionally these happen, but thank you for sticking around for this one. There was something that happened recently in the Mormon headlines that surprised me to see, but yet I wasn't surprised to hear it. The church just retired the Boyd K. Packer Little Factories speech. If anybody remembers back to episode, I think it was special edition episode 10, Rot in Hell, Boyd K. Packer. Most controversial of all of my episodes because I say some very appalling and horrifying things about Boyd K. Packer that I explain a little bit in the episode following it. But that being said, this Little Factory speech is something that tainted the minds of so many people from the day that it was spoken from the pulpit. It was in a time when Boyd K. Packer was still coherent, not crazy, and wheelchair bound. It was more, it seems like, the firebrand days of his apostleship. It was 40 years ago that speech was given. 40 fucking years. That thing has been tainting, destroying the minds of people, saying that if you don't mess with your little factory, then it won't start to produce and overproduce. You don't open up the valve because then the factory has to produce more. It's just absolutely stupid. Absolutely insane. If you want to hear the crux of that speech, you can listen to the Boyd K. Packer episode. I covered it in immense detail and called Boyd K. Packer many names during it and his other 3 speeches that I analyzed in that episode. But we can rest assured that now this cancerous, horrifying speech is off of the Mormon market. But my question kind of is like, why the fuck did it take them so long to figure this out? Like, are you shitting me? 40 years. Like, this thing has been cancerous since it came out. And just now they're realizing this isn't very PR friendly. We need to retire this. There's absolutely no foundation for this in science. Not like that's ever stopped the church from preaching falsehoods before, but like this was given in the 20th century and it somehow spanned past the century, the turn of the millennium into the 2000s, more than a decade and a half into 2000. That this speech still was printed and published and included in church manuals and people referencing the Little Factory speech. People that are my age and older will know exactly what you're talking about. You know, a fair number of Mormons younger than me even know the Little Factory speech. And I guess that's kind of where I have this inkling of optimism here. Like, the only way that we can get the church to change is by holding their feet to the fire on something, by calling them bigots and non-scientific and moronic. It was probably the best way to describe that speech. And calling them out on it, shining a spotlight on this stupidity in their history. This is a time, this is a crux when the Mormon church is saying this is something in our recent history that we don't want future generations growing up with. And I think that's wonderful. They haven't been phasing out many of the damaging doctrines fast enough. I mean, they're still violent homophobes and they're still horrible misogynists. But seeing this pamphlet being eradicated from the church's typical published doctrine, having this removed from what they teach from the pulpit nowadays, making it so people have to dig in the church archives to find this speech, it feels like, in one way, it's a step in the right direction. Like, this is what we're wanting them to do. We want them to make reforms, even if it's just one little speech at a time. But then I also think, in 100 years, will anybody even know what the Little Factory speech was? Will anybody even make reference to it? Will that even be a thing in people's minds? I mean, by then, I'm going to be long gone. Unless I'm downloaded and synthesized into a computer chip by that point. But, I mean, I won't be able to talk about the little factory speech at that time. Will anybody be talking about it? So in one way, we're seeing the church become a little more progressive by trying to remove these things, these damaging teachings from their doctrine. But we're also seeing a revision of history in the making. How hard is it going to be to find the little factory speech on the church's website now? Can we even find it? How far do we have to dig to find that on an actual church server? What does this mean from, speaking in the abstract? What? How long until this is just what they do with everything they're ashamed of? Just ignore it and delete it from their servers, and hopefully people don't bring it up. Well, I'm not okay with that. You can try to run from your history, but it's always going to bite you in the ass.